morning, everybody. We would like to begin almost on time as we welcome you all to this roundtable, national roundtable on the CARICOM Commission Report on marijuana, originally published in 2018. The reason for this is very simple. We, as part of the non-state actors and the Conference of Churches of Grenada, recognize that groups such as ours have a responsibility to take part in the shaping of public opinion. And when the government called indirectly some weeks ago for discussions on these matters, we saw it as an excellent opportunity to try to push things forward. Because on such an important matter as this, every voice must be heard and every viewpoint respected, even as we seek to determine what is in the best interest of all Grenada. So the program this morning begins with an invocation, and my task is quite simply to do that invocation. I was tempted to take you back to the presidential inauguration and to just play for you the poem by Amanda Gorman. But I want to leave you quite simply to take a few quiet moments just to breathe in the air that we have here. It's not pure, it's air conditioned, but it's still to take a good deep breath as we ask the Almighty to be with us through these proceedings and that His Spirit may pervade all that we say and do. Kumbaya, Lord, Kumbaya, Kumbaya, Lord, Kumbaya, Kumbaya, Lord, Kumbaya, O Lord, Kumbaya. Someone's praying, Lord, Kumbaya. Someone's praying, Lord, Kumbaya. Someone's praying, Lord, Kumbaya. O Lord, Kumbaya. And so, gracious God, You are the source of everything that is. And as we seek to continue to understand the unfolding mystery of the universe and of all that You have created, we know, Lord, that we fall short in so many ways. And yet, as we come to consider this report on marijuana, known by many names, we ask You, Lord, to guide us so that we may really delve into the depths of that mysterious reality, so that as we stand with open minds before all that is said today, that we may be able to discern the true path for Grenada, even as we share that path with our CARICOM brothers and sisters. Bless us. Bless every contributor, both in this room and through the technology with which You have blessed us human beings. And may everyone who comes to share in this experience, even today and then in the days to come, when it will be shown, we trust, to many, many more people, that we all may benefit to our own personal development and to the growth of our country. You are our God, living and reigning, all-powerful and all-loving, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And now I want to introduce to you the chairman of the Conference of Churches Grenada, Reverend Silbert Prescott, who will make some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Bishop Harvey. Honorable Minister of Agriculture, the Honorable Peter David, Professor Rosemary Antoine, Chair of the CARICOM Commission on Marijuana, members of the various panels, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen present here in this hall, as well as those joining us via social media, good morning to one and all. Over the past few months, a number of issues have featured prominently in the national, regional, and global arena. They include the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, the transfer of power in the US, and many other issues. However, beneath the surface of these issues is the simmering subject surrounding the use of marijuana. Of course, the pros and cons surrounding marijuana is not new. It is not a new discussion. As far back as the 1960s and early 70s, amidst overwhelming scientific evidence which attests to the medical properties contained in marijuana, led to a number of people in various countries, including the US and many US countries in Europe, to advocate for reform of laws regarding the use of marijuana. The discussion around the subject ranges from decriminalization of the substance to legalization for medical and recreational use. Here in the Caribbean, many of us would recall reggae singer Bob Marley making the link between marijuana and the leaf of the tree, which Revelation purports will bring healing to the nation. Peter Tosh, also back in the 1970s with his hit song, Legalize It, gave voice to the growing call for changes to the legal regimes regarding marijuana. The call was given for the impetus in the Caribbean when in March 2014, the Caribbean Heads of Government meeting held in St. Vincent established a commission to explore the possibilities for reform in marijuana laws. This has since then put the issue on the front burner of the discussion in the islands of the Caribbean region. As a responsible social partner, the Conference of Churches, in conjunction with the Interagency Group of Developing Organizations, are committed to facilitating and providing a platform for debate on issues of natural importance. And it is in this regard we came together to organize this roundtable to reflect on issues recorded in the Commission on Marijuana, which we referred to earlier. This is to provide an opportunity for individuals and groups to reflect and to contribute to the national debate from an informed position. And hence, I want to extend a warm invitation or welcome to all of us who have gathered here and elsewhere to join in this debate as we lay the groundwork and begin the discussion here in Grenada. I trust that we will have a wonderful and stimulating day of discussions, and I pray that most of us will leave this place and wherever we are gathered on the various social media platforms as more informed persons ready to engage in the debate surrounding this subject. So I just want to welcome all of you and trust that we will have a wonderful day together. God bless.
The day's format is fairly straightforward. We will begin with some opening remarks from the Minister, the Honorable Peter David. And then the basic format is that Professor Rosemary Bell-Antoine, who is the chair of the commission that prepared the report, she will make a presentation via Zoom, which we will listen to, and then there will be an open response to that insofar as we may want to ask questions or have clarifications. After Professor Antoine's talk, then we were considering 3 areas that we felt we needed to focus on in dealing with the report. One is health, secondly, it's the economic issues, and then the legal issues. So we have basically 3 panel discussions where we trust that people will respond to the elements of these issues which are in the report, with some time left for us in the hall to respond to that as well. The hope is that we can both get solid meat from the panel presentations and then from the other comments. All of this will lead into, both at the end of the morning and at the end of the afternoon, a summary of the takeaway points from that discussion. Bearing in mind all the time that the idea is to present, or rather to put together, a visual presentation, audio-visual presentation, which can then be used by community groups, by church groups, to stimulate discussion on the issue. Because the more discussion we have, hopefully, the more informed will public opinion be that can influence whatever the government does in formulating some legislation for the way forward, if they so decide to do. So that's the basic way forward. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a man who needs no introduction in terms of Grenada, but those of you who will be listening to this overseas, the Honorable Peter David has been Minister, I was going to say Minister of everything at one time or another, but he is now Minister of Agriculture. And as Minister of Agriculture, he has some, with the Attorney General, a lot of responsibility for areas which have to do with what we're discussing today. And I always say it takes a bit of political courage to go where others do not want to tread. So I really want to thank him in advance for being here, and we look forward to his opening remarks. Minister David.
Thank you, Bishop Harvey. Good morning, everyone in the room, everyone on Zoom, and thank you for inviting me here. I want to first of all thank the organizers, the IAGDO, the Interagency Group of Development Organizations, and the Conference of Churches. I want to thank Bishop Harvey and my dear Reverend here for the participation and the work you're doing in this regard. And on behalf of the government, say to you that the job you're doing assists us tremendously with respect to the consultation that we refer to. I also want to thank CARICOM for yet another excellent example of what we can do together as a region. There are persons who sometimes lament the shortcomings of CARICOM. I want to praise CARICOM for this initiative in bringing the region together on such an important issue, and to thank the Commission itself and all of the commissioners for the excellent work they've done. I want to thank Chairperson, Professor Rosemary Bell-Antoine, for her excellent chairmanship or chairpersonship of this very important commission, and to thank the Commission for an excellent report. I think the report, from my reading of the report truly reflected, and this sometimes doesn't happen, truly reflected the region, the position of the people in the region, and what the roadmap should be going forward. And the recommendations, an excellent working document as a basis for the way forward for Caribbean governments and Caribbean peoples. when I read the report myself, there are things in the report that I felt, but the report gave me the basis, the empirical basis on which to support the position that I instinctively held. I, apart from being Minister of Agriculture, which my dear brother Harvey indicated, which gives me certain responsibilities, I spent more than 20 years practicing criminal law, solely criminal law in Grenada, and more than 10 years practicing criminal law in New York. So I came face to face with the negative effects of what the Commission itself calls a legal regime characterized by draconian criminal penalties. And I agree with the conclusion that the laws, as I saw them, were ineffective, discriminatory, deeply unjust, unfit for purpose, violative of rights, and lacking legitimacy. I agree when the Commission came to that conclusion, a conclusion that I think reflects most and the overwhelming majority of people and governments in the Caribbean. I look forward to a discussion today on these, and that would certainly assist the government in drafting its own position. I was very pleased also when the Commission report concludes that the overwhelming majority of people in the region support change of the status quo. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised some years ago when I was speaking to a pollster in the region who indicated to me that even in Grenada there was overwhelming support, because quietly, you felt that the loud voices in opposition reflected the true position. I am surprised, and the fact that the Conference of Churches is here this morning hosting this activity is an indication of where we are as a people on this very important subject. And the truth is, the numbers are growing in terms of the numbers of persons who are supporting change of the status quo. In Grenada, we have a similar shift in a direction of support for change, and that is reflected by none other than our Prime Minister, the Honorable Right Honorable Keith Mitchell, who several years ago, and he admits this, we're not saying anything that he doesn't say, who admits that he had opposed change to the status quo some years ago. And to his credit, he has accepted that he has changed his views and now supports change of the status quo. And I think in his comments, he mostly speaks to the impact it has, and I think we all can agree on this, the impact that the criminalization of small amounts of cannabis and cannabis in general has had on our youth. Experiences that I have had in courts. I have had young people come for me to represent them in courts with small amounts of cannabis. There are university students who are facing expulsion because of criminal record, who cannot get a visa to travel to a country where they want to go study, be it Canada, the US, or other countries, because they have a criminal record. In fact, when the government, a few years ago, and I was in the Senate at the time, and piloted the Rehabilitation of Offenders Bill, it was an attempt to remove records of young people who found themselves in this position. So the Prime Minister speaks a lot about that, and that is a major issue confronting us here today, and I look forward to the views of persons in the room and on Zoom on that. The issue of hundreds, if not, in Grenada, and thousands throughout the region who have criminal records for small amounts of cannabis. Not only records, but talking about imprisonment. Talking about the amount of monies that we spend on law enforcement, rather than other issues that are much more in need of that expenditure in the Caribbean. In all of the comments, though, the Prime Minister has indicated that one must not ignore, and the report also speaks to this, one must not ignore the potential negative consequences of going in a particular direction, in particular, the issue of young people and the age range that would be allowed or should be allowed use of cannabis, in addition to the question of driving. while under the influence, an issue raised by the Commission. And I look forward to the comments on that, because while we move forward, and I think there is a general consensus that we have to effect change, we must also do the change in a way that does not have negative consequences for our young people, for our society in general. So those are some of the challenges that we face. And while final determination of all, the government at this time, let me say this, the government at this time, and the Prime Minister has indicated, and the government has indicated, the government of Grenada accepts the report, and the government will move forward to effect changes. We will do consultations, this included as one of them. At the same time, we do believe that there is a general consensus, so we can move quickly on some aspects of it that I will outline in a minute. So the government has already drafted some legislation. That legislation will be submitted to the Parliament and allowed for discussion for some time, and certainly the Conference of Churches, the IAGDO, and all these organizations will have an opportunity to comment. But I do hope it is not one of these consultations that go on for years and years, and the problem remains for years and years, because I think, based on all that the Commission has said and based on all that has happened in the region, that we do already have a consensus on certain aspects of this that we can move forward with while we await a consensus and a decision on some of the more difficult parts. So I look forward to that. So while there has not been a final determination, we are already on course to make some changes. For example, I think there's a consensus that we must decriminalize certain amounts. We've seen it happen in nearly all of the Caribbean islands, where ranging from 15 grams to 28 grams has been allowed for personal use in the home. So there is a certain level of consensus on that, and I am sure that we can move forward on that. The question of cultivation of a small amount. Some people say 3 trees, 5 trees, 7 trees. Certainly an amount in the quiet of your home can be grown by users. So I think there is a consensus. Some countries say 5 trees, some countries say 3, some countries say possession of 28 grams, some say 15 grams in a region. But I think it's a question of how many, not whether or not we make those changes. So that is there. And the use by the Rastafarian community for their sacramental purposes. So I think there is a consensus on those 3 things: the Rastafarians and the use of it as a sacrament, the cultivation of small amounts, and decriminalization. With respect to the larger issues, and certainly as Minister of Agriculture, I would close on that. The larger issue of cultivation for medicinal purposes and for possibilities of economic benefits to the country, I want to commend the report too for spending some time on that. Because I think as a society we have to take control of that and ensure that we use it in a way that benefits our society and benefits our farmers. We need to have much more discussion on that, and that may take a little longer time. So in the medium and long term, the issue of medical marijuana and the issue of cultivation may take a little more time, but we have to begin that process of discussion today. So there's a short run, the medium, and the long run. As Minister of Agriculture, I look forward to that. I look forward to us going in that direction. I know I will conclude in a minute, but to say this, as a parent and a grandparent, I am absolutely elated to have lived long enough to see this day come when we are discussing this issue. As the report says, the current position is obsolete, and deeply unjust. With all of the available evidence of the history, one of the things I want to say to the Commissioner and Bishop is that I was always curious in the court as to why this thing was illegal. I mean, there are some trees growing and it becomes illegal, and I was happy to read the history to show that it was in the 1930s or early 20th century when this thing became illegal for reasons other than it being a dangerous drug. And I am happy that our society, and I urge everyone to read the report. Sometimes we have opinions that can be changed by seeking knowledge. The report has all the information. Cannabis can no longer, in my view, be accurately described as a dangerous drug with no medicinal and other value. it has value. We may agree that there are some possible negative consequences of overuse, youth use, but I think the report clearly establishes that it has other values, including medicinal value. You know, I used to say in the courthouse over and over that I'm sure we will move to decriminalization and legalization when the big countries do it. Unfortunately, we are here now. They have done it and they are taking the market. We have to run from behind. Unfortunately, the region is running a little from behind because we didn't move as quickly as we should have. In closing, I want to quote the Commission on the way forward. Just to quote, the end goal should be the dismantling of prohibition in its totality, to be replaced by a strictly regulated framework akin to that of alcohol and tobacco, which are harmful substances that are not legalized. However, the Commission went on to say, it is recognized that law reform can take many forms and should conform to national realities. Meaning that while we move forward as a region, the Commission recognized that each country will do it according to its specific conditions and the state of consciousness of the people with respect to that. Again, I want to say that the government of Grenada will soon be bringing legislation before the people, will soon be bringing legislation before the stakeholders, so that hopefully we can confront this issue. I look forward today to the discussions. I look forward today with anxiety to the results of the discussions, because I dare say that the results of today's consultation will greatly influence the government and the people on the way forward. I thank you, and I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Thank you very much, Minister David, for your information. And at one point I was saying to myself, I hope that Professor Antoine doesn't believe that because you say such good things about the report that she doesn't have to speak now. But thank you. And I will say in advance, Minister David says he has to leave a little later on. He will listen certainly to Professor Antoine, but if you see him slipping out, it's not because he hears something that displeases him or that he's wanting to not pay due respects. I want to note that we have here in the hall with us members of the Rastafari community, and I also have to note that they came on time, which is more than can be said for everybody. But it's great to have you here, brothers, and we hope that you will make your own contribution in due course. Now, it is my absolute privilege to introduce somebody who's coming to us by Zoom. I have no particular love for this mode of communication, but it's what we have to do these days. She is the chair of the CARICOM Regional Commission on Marijuana, currently one of the most powerful women in terms of influence in the region, Dean of the Faculty of Law at University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and an award-winning author, attorney, activist, and international legal consultant. She's won many international awards and honors for her scholarship, which has been described by international jurists as original, insightful, and amazing. As a human being, she is much loved and respected throughout the region and beyond. And when we were able to get her for this moment, I felt we were very privileged indeed. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you and ask our technicians to make available to us, Zoom-wise, Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine, who will speak to the report itself and introduce the report to us.
Thank you so much. It's my absolute pleasure to be here, and good morning everyone. All of you are very distinguished people there, and very holy people too. I am happy to please to be able to do it. As you know, it's unusual circumstances, so my voice is not as powerful as always, but with the grace of God, and I know it's a very important happening in Grenada, so let's see how it goes. Certainly a very important topic, and I'm so happy that Grenada is now on board, from what I've heard from the Honorable Minister. As you know, the commission was created by CARICOM heads of government because it was extremely controversial at the time, and it was felt that a neutral, independent body could guide the way forward, depoliticize the issue, because very often these issues end up being, politicized. And I think that is exactly what happened. We had an excellent team on the commission. What's important to note is that it was a multidisciplinary team. So we had medical doctors, we had a scientist who had been working on cannabis for many years at Mona. We had social workers, we had a youth representative. We even had a pastor, so we had the religious side represented. And it took us a while. Initially, we had some funding issues, but it wasn't our problem, of course, but CARICOM had to, we didn't get the funding at first to do the consultations, because it was always the idea that we had to listen to the people, apart from our own research and so on, and that entailed going all over the Caribbean, holding public consultations, and also smaller stakeholder meetings. A very, very, me personally, very enriching and rewarding experience. I learned so much from my fellow CARICOM citizens. Sometimes very moving, I must say. And as has already been said, even from that time to now, we can see that the growing consensus towards reform in terms of the law on marijuana. Let me just say that we'll call the Marijuana Commission, but we recognize that marijuana itself has a negative connotation. So this is why we use marijuana stroke cannabis in the report, and I probably will use cannabis in my presentation. For me personally, and we all started off quite neutral, well, I certainly for many years had been probably on the other side, doing work in terms of anti-drug, so on and so on. But at the end of that whole process, it was very clear to me, and my own personal commitment is that there must be not just law reform, but perhaps in the longer term, depending on how countries, some need to creep, some need to jump, that it must be not just decriminalized, but it should be legalized, and we will explain as we go along. And that is very much my own firm conviction today. So we have reimagined the issue, and as was said, the vast majority of people we spoke to across the region, and also we did some polling, is that the people of the Caribbean want the law to change. Not always for the same reasons, but social injustice is a huge issue in the whole discussion. But I want to say up front that the medical marijuana had not been as large in terms of our discussions when we started, but of course now it has become even more important. So there are some people, I guess, who are more interested in the sort of the profit that can give. But when we wrote this report, and still now, the social justice issues, to me, still remain at the forefront. So there's overwhelming support, at least for decriminalization. So I cannot say with any accuracy that everybody wanted to legalize it, as Peter Tosh said. But certainly, as a baseline, most people say at least decriminalize. People should not be in jails if they use cannabis, at the very least. And many, many prominent persons and groups have lent their voices to discourse of all walks of life, including church leaders, and you will recall our own former Archbishop of Trinidad and Tobago talking about this as well. And we've had magistrate judges, DPP members of parliament, many people who have said no, at least decriminalization. Minister, yes, when we did some polling, 2018, in Grenada it was 61% who said that it should change. And I suspect if we did polling today, it would be probably in the 80s or the 90s. I always recall when we did the consultation in Barbados, because we did most of the countries. As you know, we did not get the opportunity to do Grenada, so I'm happy there's been a change of mind. But when we went to Barbados, to a packed audience, I always recall a group of persons, elderly persons, many of them, with disabilities in wheelchairs. They begged the commission to change the law for them to access medical marijuana. So, and in the consultations as well, we've heard all the stories of trauma, especially from the Rastafarian movement, and who have, of course, suffered a lot because of the draconian laws in terms of cannabis. So, as was just said, we believe the draconian legal regime is ineffective. It is indeed discriminatory, unjust, doesn't at all respect the rights of citizens, and lack legitimacy. And this whole what we call prohibition, and you recall we had prohibition of alcohol not so long ago, is also preventing us from taking advantage of whatever economic opportunities that may exist in the cannabis industry. And more importantly, something that we often overlook, in the current regime, once it's illegal, you can't legitimately do research on cannabis. So this has been a hindrance in terms of the scientists even moving forward the agenda in terms of cannabis. And of course, prohibiting persons in terms of the medical effects, which I think today nobody disputes. Prohibiting citizens access to medicine that can heal them, not just more effectively, but more cheaply than traditional pharmaceuticals. And so we understand, I think, that this is not good law, it is ineffective. The law must have a purpose, it must be there to correct a wrong society, and I certainly believe, and we all believe, that the regime right now offends the rule of law because it never had a rational basis for criminalizing it. And law should have a basis, to correct a harm or mischief. But when you have laws that what really is the mischief that is designed to correct, then it is time to change. So the legal history, and the minister mentioned that he got some justification reading about it. Marijuana, of course, has been used, cannabis has been used for thousands of years, and so much misunderstanding about it. We remember, many of us can remember our grandparents using cannabis. It used before decriminalization, which really is not that old. It was in the 1930s and before that changed. Using it, the East Indians, for instance, coming from the fields, is part of their culture. In fact, I suspect ganja comes from Ganges. That is my own sort of theory, to relax and whatever, without any sort of persecutions. It was only about 100 years ago that it became illegal, and of course once it became illegal, stigmatized and so on. We used to use it for bush tea, etc., etc. And the deep historical, cultural, and religious significance to Caribbean peoples cannot be ignored. So several ethnic groups, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and even the Chinese, know it as having healing properties, which is what the Rastafarians have told us for a very long time. And well, I always like to mention that every time we had consultations, the Rastafarian community, who really, they have kept the light burning. They have been the ones lobbying over the years, when I guess other people gave up their own deep religious sacramental meaning for that community. And they've often quoted for us from the Bible, the every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things, Genesis 9:3. And many other passages in the Bible that they used to say that this is a sacred plant that we have now criminalized. And of course, perhaps we don't know this, but in the 60s and so when we began, and a bit later also, the Caribbean was one of the first to start patenting medical products. Dr. West from Mona, who you created Canasol for the treatment of glaucoma for the eyes. So the notion that cannabis or marijuana is a dangerous drug without any value really had never had any valid basis for it. And yet it led to international treaties and all over the world these laws which has caused so much harm, harsh criminal penalties in all forms, usually within a context of strict liability, meaning that you have no discretion once you're caught with a couple ounces, the judge has no discretion but to jail you and so on. And the scandal is that this designation of being a dangerous drug, scheduled as a dangerous drug and in treaties and so on, had no scientific or medical data at all to support this classification. And clearly now we know a misleading status. There's been one very, very important development very recently. Last month, in fact, WHO finally has declared that it should be reclassified, so it's no longer as a dangerous drug, and that has been a lot of hard work went into that, international lobbying to get that. So we still wait for these treaties to be abandoned, but it's very important that the WHO has said there's no basis for cannabis to be treated as a dangerous drug. It is not a dangerous drug. So we've already made a huge step in that regard. And really what we can call a legal fiction, the laws. And it is very significant given the harshness of the law, which was premised on the supposed harm of it. So we created a criminal law that downpressed thousands of people without any evidence that it was harmful. But what is more egregious, and I think even more sinister, is that there's enough evidence from that it wasn't just an accident, that this regime, this draconian prohibition regime came about. It was a deliberate move by particularly in the US and so the Schaefer Commission and the Nixon and so, that it was done deliberately to shift and to stifle competition with alcohol. And so that whole history is very sordid, and we've had this bad reputation. Laws are very powerful. Once you create something, make it illegal, it can do a lot of harm in terms of connotations and so on. And just as long ago when alcohol was under prohibition, it was seen as something almost sinful. But once the illegal regime was lifted, it is now seen as socially acceptable and morally acceptable, although we know that alcohol is dangerous. So it's the same thing that happened with cannabis. So the issues then for us are questions of social justice, the efficacy of law enforcement, whether in fact having these draconian laws served any purpose at all, even in terms of prohibiting human rights, of course, and the moral basis of the law. And we believe that cannabis should be taken out of the criminal justice system altogether, should not be viewed through a narrow criminal law lens, and certainly has failed. The criminal law has certainly failed. So now the Commission envisaged it and envisages it going forward as a public health issue and also a human rights issue. And that is how we would like to frame it. So in the context of the right to health, and of course, in terms of the human rights, protection against discrimination, and also your right to health. But certainly public health will always be there, because we do know that although it may not be harmful in the way we consider it before, it is psychoactive. So the enthusiasm on the ground sort of support that we have seen and is growing, and the notion that more and more persons are accepting the social justice issues, I still believe should be the priority. I am a bit concerned, quite frankly, about the embrace of CARICOM a couple of years since the report was launched in terms of the medical cannabis industry, perhaps with less emphasis on the social injustice issues that really I think are the priority. I'm not saying that we should not, of course, move towards medical cannabis. Sure, we can, but we should not neglect the deeper issues, which really is the fuel for our report and our findings. And when we investigated all of the evidence, scientific, medical, legal, social data, and so on, it was clear that the public opinion demonstrates that the existing prohibitionist regime induces more harm than any possible adverse consequences of cannabis. And in fact, in many ways, the horse has already bolted because it was very clear that despite all of these draconian laws in place, Caribbean nationals, including children, are already accessing marijuana. And this is the finding all over the world, by the way. There's a very high percentage of people all over the world who use cannabis despite prohibitionist laws. We've met people who describe themselves as medical refugees in terms of being able to access cannabis from other countries and not being harassed. Uh, so, again, to emphasize that despite the medical marijuana issues, the social justice ones are ones I really would like Grenada to get it right in terms of that. So, again, the penalties in terms of cannabis, it really is quite incongruous and again unjust because, in fact, you can end up being. I'm sorry, I just need a little water if you don't mind. 1 second. I'm actually lying on a bed, so it's a little. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Grenada is my mother's home country, so I had to do this for Grenada. Right. Yes, so we all agree that the status quo needs to be changed. We have to accept that cannabis is a substance with psychoactive properties. There is potential for negative health consequences, just as there's potential for alcohol, for tobacco, and so on. We do believe that there are mental health complications for the youth in particular, but the risks, when you look at them, are quite specific and I dare say minimal in terms of the overall risks. But in terms of youth, we were very clear that that was something that we needed to pay more attention to, and there needed to be more research because we had conflicting reports about effects on youth. So we took a conservative approach, sorry, in that regard. But even if I like to talk about when you're growing up, your parents said don't drink coffee to make your head hard. I think it is quite clear that until you become an adult, your brain doesn't really react to any of these substances in the way that adults should. So we do believe that there is caution, there should be great caution. I am aware that some of our colleagues, I know some Rastafarians, for example, said they give their children the tea, the ganja tea, and there's been no effect. And the jury is still out, but we took a conservative approach. And as I said, with many other substances, alcohol, coffee, all of these, there's enough evidence that young people should not be using these. So, in the same way, and that is what I mean about the public health issues in relation to this. There were some myths that were abounding, and even up till a couple of years ago, I was at a judiciary conference, and judges were saying to me, "But doesn't marijuana cause you to engage in criminal behavior?" The answer is no. What causes and these are some of the myths that we talk about, but the scientific evidence has now disproved. If anything, is the opposite. Cannabis causes you to chill, to sort of but I don't know another word to say chill, but essentially it placates you. It doesn't rile you up the way alcohol does. Where the criminal aspect comes into it is because of the draconian laws that we have created. It is because of that prohibitionist regime that creates the gangs and the whatnot, not the substance itself. And also the myths in terms of, cannabis being a gateway drug. There's enough evidence now from the science that that is not so, meaning that if you start off with cannabis, you're going to graduate to cocaine and so, which are harmful and not at all natural substances, of course. So we have, there's the science is disproving that these are myths. And incidentally, my deputy chair, Professor Abel, who's a psychiatrist in Mona, after, or actually just when we were about to launch a report, because of course, Jamaica went first with the decriminalization. He had been doing studies in that time in relation to his mental patients, and he was able to report that indeed there was no sort of effect. His results are very positive in relation to that as well. Also, the addiction issues like addiction and psychosis. And we heard a lot of um, in every session we had one or two persons who would say, "But I have seen where young people took marijuana and they ended up mad, as the case may be," and that may be so. But what the science is saying that, well, one, as I mentioned, young people should not be taking it, and two, we also learned, and the evidence shows that often they combine cannabis, whether it is alcohol or whether it is substance, and that itself. So those are the kinds of things in terms of disproving the myth. But clearly, the scientific evidence now establishes that cannabis is less harmful, or at least no more harmful, than substances that are already prohibited or criminalized under law, like alcohol. So we don't throw you in jail when you take a drink. Although alcohol, lethal rate is 50 for alcohol, 100 for cocaine, and zero for cannabis in terms of how lethal it is. So really, something is wrong with that picture. So we can regulate, but why do we need to put people in jail? And really, it's also one of those drugs that it's a victimless drug. So when you take it, if something happens to you, it's you and you alone. Whereas we know alcohol and these others, get you agitated and so on. So the most significant is the persuasive evidence that exists for the negative effects on the adolescent brain and on driving. And of course, as you know, and as was said, our recommendation say not at all, at least up to 21, we would not recommend it, except of course medical treatment and so, because we do know there are issues with epilepsy with treatments. So we did find on the balance that the proven medical benefits outweighed the risks, and that is consistent with other bodies, other commissions, UN Commission on Drug Policy, and so on. In fact, they labeled the current legal regime as redundant, and the scientific data supports it. So, a controlled regulatory environment. And one of the reasons why, apart from not being quite sure the impact on the brain for young people, is also because marijuana, cannabis, it demotivates you. And I don't think we want our children, when they are supposed to be learning in school and so on, to be demotivated. And that's the same chill thing, you feel irie and all of that. So this is another reason why we would not want young people to use it, and children. So a public health rights-based non-prohibitionist approach. And we also, in terms of the criminal classification, clearly it is flawed. And now that the WHO is agreeing, there can be no argument again about that. It's dangerous drug and so on. And we found too that they were ineffective. And estimated 183 million people use cannabis all over the world. I must say I was quite surprised how many children we met, and because we had special sessions with the children too, who who admitted that they used marijuana. It was very easy to get access to it. So we are fooling ourselves. if we think that these laws that we have in place is preventing anybody from using it. So on that basis alone, I think is grounds for change. So really, it is counterproductive. And we found in our consultations right across rich, poor, black, white, all social classes, professions, race, religion, stood up and said, "Well, I use cannabis." Of course, it was very frank discussions. Nobody would get arrested saying it then. So people were very frank with us, and this is what our polls also showed us. So it really was a is a remnant, the whole prohibitionist legal regime, of what we now know is a discredited war on drugs approach, which has failed. It hasn't deterred usage. It has created probably gangs. It has created more inequities in our criminal justice system, and there's enough already. And we know too that even when you get to jail, quite ironically, access to marijuana is sometimes even more. People told us that. So the important thing about the criminal justice system too is the harshness of it. Apart from the fact that you can be jailed easily, if you do get fined or if there are bail requirements, it's usually the poor that get arrested and you can't pay the fines. So everybody ends up in jail. We had instances in Guyana where 80 something year olds were sent to jail. We had one in Trinidad, an elderly lady too was using the cannabis for her pain, and she was, and that's all that helped her. And of course, she was also incarcerated. So the propensity to incarcerate people, the warehousing phenomenon, led to and leads to a wasteful and very costly system where many potentially productive lives and families have been destroyed without any benefit to society. And there's some gender dimensions in there because the mothers are imprisoned. We heard very heartrending stories, where the families takes care of them. And even law. Oh, I forgot to say, I had an assistant police commissioner from Jamaica on my commission as well, and he was very pro to legalize. He said after all these years he's seen the damage, and many law enforcement personnel, surprisingly perhaps for some, complained that this was a very ineffective, wasteful system, and they felt that their resources were better employed fighting serious crime. And we did some questionnaires with the police as well, and that was the result. So the police are just doing their job. And in fact, if the laws are there and they can make the arrest, they will do it. But many of them agree that this should not be. And they also said to us that they do not believe that cannabis is a causative factor in criminal conduct. They said usually in their experience, cannabis persons use it for stress relief to calm things down. And I think that was a very important sort of idea coming out of all our research and so on. But of course, they talked about the turf and the gang wars leading to the violence, etc. What we have noticed too is the tendency now to hype up the cannabis, to mix it with other things, other artificial products, to raise the THC levels, which is the one that causes the high. And that too is because of the illegal sort of regime, and it gets more expensive and its whole vicious cycle. Um, Very important for me personally, and I think for many of us, is that this law is very discriminatory. In every session I ask the police, why is it? Because people complain to us, and I think people know this. Why is it that you tend to target certain people to arrest for cannabis? Usually, as Gypsy would say, the little black boy. So it is already the poor and the marginalized who get arrested for cannabis. And you know what they told us? But it's easier. It's easier to do it that way, and they're aware of it. So they will be climbing on the block, etc. And I guess they don't have a fancy lawyer too. But we know that marijuana is used as a glamour drug. You see it on television, Hollywood. The upper middle classes use it in their private parties. They are not arrested. So what we have done is to create a law that disproportionately impacts the poorest persons, and of course those are the persons who cannot afford the bail and the etc. and the etc. And don't get me started on remand. People stay for long periods on remand. In fact, one of the reasons that the remand situation was dealt with and tried to deal with in Jamaica was when a young boy, 15 years old, Mariano, was arrested for a spliff, small amount of marijuana, ended up dead in the jails. And that caused them to try to change the remand system because, as you know, when you're arrested and you go on remand, you stay long, long periods, another injustice. So it's a law that is also subject to abuse because of this inequity, and it is unenforceable. Clearly has been unenforceable. It's inappropriate and irrelevant. And the penalties, huh, it is really ludicrous that you can be arrested for intent to do bodily harm, which is a very serious criminal offense, and you another person can be arrested in most of our laws because we ramped up our laws 1.5 grams of marijuana, and it could attract up to 40 years in jail for the marijuana, whereas the person who almost killed you could get a non-custodial sentence. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago, when they increased the penalties for cannabis some time ago, it was challenged. The judges pronounced that it was unconstitutional, the penalties and so on. But they still, at the time, there wasn't a discretion. They were able to take their discretion. This is the kind of inequity even within the criminal penalties we have. So when you compare what happens in terms of other serious offenses and what happens when you get arrested for cannabis, it really is unacceptable. And as I mentioned before, often there is no choice to judges. And sometimes the judges say this, they say, with a heavy heart, I have to sentence you, etc., etc. So the law is definitely too harsh and turns a blind eye to other offenses. So really, we need to change it. We've had um, we've had many instances of over sentencing in relation to these laws. Um, well, I just wanted some of Grenada, just okay. All right, so the disproportionality, the inconsistency, the injustice, all of these issues come to bear, even though it's a victimless crime and a travesty in the justice system. All of this leads us to think it undermines the legitimacy of the law and inhibits its enforcement. Um, as one person told us, a plant is not a criminal. Yeah. The social and the legal dimensions also in terms of the human rights issues. What we have also, of course, with the stereotyping and the prejudices, I mentioned the Rastafarians. They have had a really rough time. I know in Antigua they gave an apology, etc., and they talk about reparations because they were really persecuted in relation to cannabis. Um, the drug itself and drug use itself, we know from our studies, is often a function of poverty and lack of opportunities as a coping mechanism, for instance. So what we're doing is a legal system that penalizes and criminalizes persons who are already vulnerable. And these are already very broad social issues, not solved by criminalization. You don't solve that by throwing people in jail. And this is why I say I support medical marijuana, yes, but we cannot forget these very important social issues. I should also tell you that there's been a lot of jurisprudence in the last few years, which also started with Canada and the US, the case of Allard and so on, which have also led to conclusions that there are human rights in terms of health. In Canada, for example, Allard, where a person who was a cancer patient was growing a plant in order to make tea to treat his cancer. He won his case on the right to health, to be able to treat oneself, health. So little by little, we're getting cases coming forward which are saying to us that it cannot stand the prohibition. In our own neck of the woods, since the report was used in the McCoffey case, my colleague Judge Ventos used the report to rule in favor of the unconstitutionality in St. Kitts as well, one of the cases involving. On the same thing with being using it for medical treatment and so on. So the legal the jurisprudence and the human rights issues are also telling us that this regime, this legal regime, cannot stand for long, and more cases are coming before the courts, challenging the rights of persons to self-medicate, etc. And of course, we always have the right, freedom of religion, in terms of the Rastafarian community, is always there, as well as one of the human rights. In the Barry Francis case that I mentioned, when the Trinidad changed the penalty to 40 years imprisonment, what the court said, it was arbitrary, capricious, oppressive. The sentencing formula was cruel and inhumane punishment, excessive and wholly disproportionate to the offense. That was the court in terms of that. We are learning lessons from those who have gone before. Jamaica, Uruguay was one of the first to move in the direction of legalizing. And what we are seeing, no, 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 no. Sorry, somebody is turning pages to me. Yes, right. So we are seeing, therefore, that since Jamaica in 2015 decriminalized, the latest polling revealed that, as I said, first of all, no discernible change in psychosis. In other words, it's a myth that if you were to legalize and decriminalize tomorrow, then everybody begins smoking marijuana and all sorts of things happen. There's a little bump, yes, people are curious, but it levels off, and there was certainly no increase in psychosis or mental health issues. And what we see too in Jamaica, it went up to 90% approval of legal reform. So once it started, even those who were sort of opposing were on board, saying this was the best thing that could be done. So that's very important, to learn the lessons from others. But it's not just about human rights and public health. Because this is an illegal substance, the whole cannabis issue gets entangled in the money laundering aspects of our law, because once you get profit from by unlawful means, it can be treated as money laundering, and that is part of the problem. So those of us who want to go into medical cannabis, for instance, you would still need to consider these issues, that if the substance itself is illegal, it is treated as the proceeds of crime. And the important impact of that, which Jamaica is facing, and Canada fortunately has its own Canadian banks. In California, for example, they weren't able to bank, although they had allowed marijuana, they weren't able in some of these cases to put the money in the banks, because the banks cannot accept proceeds of crime. So these are some of the complex issues where you have still have the substance as illegal. So decriminalization is one thing, but the broader brush has to be to make it legal. And it's not just about human rights and social justice, it's also about these sort of hardcore financial black and white issues. So even if you wanted to have a cottage industry, if you wanted to go all the way medical cannabis, you have to consider that if it is from an illegal substance, still it is the proceeds of crime. It's money laundering, etc. So we have to change the legal status. Um, so international law challenges, I don't say I'll say too much about that again, because I think what we need to do, all of us together, Minister, all CARICOM has to really get together, and we can be a powerful lobby group. I was in Vienna, I think it was last year, on the third, to try to get the treaties changed itself. So WHO's statement and position is a great help, but those treaties still need to be changed. And I think CARICOM could have a powerful voice. We have a lot of international groups saying the system is redundant and so, but we still have the treaties there. So I had asked for a more formal regional position. We've tended to go unilaterally, like Jamaica tried to speak to the UN, didn't get very far on her own. But I think CARICOM needs to join with like-minded states. Canada, there are quite a few now. Canada is a big one for us because of the closeness with Canada, who of course they legalized just when we were finalizing the report. So they are now fully. So we need to join up with these countries in order to get these conventions changed so that it can be a smooth transition. Um, Strong positions of solidarity, um, economic benefits. I don't want to say too much about that. We do have in the report, we did commission an economist to give a synopsis and a study on it, a separate piece of work. And overall, what he concludes is that you have more economic benefits with legalization as opposed to decriminalization. I think that's probably fairly obvious because of some of the reasons I just said there. But also, in terms of the medical cannabis industry, we do know it's a huge billion-dollar industry. We do know that the Caribbean is a force to reckon with in terms of a lot of focus on us, especially from the Canadian firms. And clearly there are benefits, but I see also that we need to be cautious because what would be really devastating, I think, for Caribbean people is if we repeat the mistakes of the past. In other words, if we sell out like what we have done with bananas, sugar, and so on, where we become, just providing the raw material and then we get very little in the end. That's a danger right now. We formed a new group, a few of us, trying to lobby CARICOM to ensure that the small farmers, the traditional farmers, are not left behind in terms of this almost like a revolution now with the medical cannabis, because we're talking about big, big business. So it's the same sort of things we've seen in the past, and we could end up with that, and it is a great worry for those of us. Certainly for me, it was mentioned in the report, but exactly what we were warning about, we are seeing happening already. There are lots of issues in Jamaica where the farmers and those who were in what they will consider the struggle for years are being marginalized, left behind. Certainly in St. Vincent, which was our first consultation, that was one of the first issues that came up. The growers told us that they were concerned about, they were afraid of. And if you think about issues like land, all of these issues have to be thought about. How are you going to get the land? Because right now, what happened in the past, if you were growing cannabis, you would do it in the hills on state land. It wasn't your land. But once you begin to regularize and license and so on, then how does the small farmer get land legitimately in order to transform these marijuana farmers who were once considered criminals into respected entrepreneurs and farmers? So you need to help with land. St. Vincent is doing some really good work in that respect. Your co-minister of agriculture, minister, former student of mine, by the way, they have given, I think, 250 acres to the traditional farmers to help them and so on. So they are going big with the medical um, cannabis industry, and licensing, of course, needs to be equitable. So it's not just simply a question of legalizing or decriminalizing and saying giving licenses. There must be equity in the whole system. I know there are lots of issues with licensing in Jamaica that only certain, the big ups, the normal thing. But we met in many young people, for instance, who want to be um, farmers, and incidentally, I myself didn't even know that cannabis as a plant, the effects and so on, is not just in of itself. I met a very interesting woman farmer in Dominica who was talking about the ways in which the crop can be used to improve other crops. Really, this plant has really wonderful properties. So there's a lot to do in agriculture as well, not just in of itself, but and the spin-offs and so on. So there's a lot of scope for entrepreneurship and niche markets and so forth. And of course, we have the hemp industry as well. We do need to develop the Caribbean medical research industry, and that can only happen if again it's legalized. Right now, because nobody has legalized right out, straight out, but has decriminalized. Even UE has been saying it. Some of those who are doing the research is saying it's actually been made more difficult because of all the restrictions, and so that you have to have security, you have to do this. So that is something that is also we're trying to look at in terms of how do you go forward in terms of having an industry. These are the sort of nitty-gritty issues that we need to do. But I do think we need to protect our hegemony. I think we have to ensure that um, people are not left behind and not just sell out to the big, large foreign companies. I mean, I have no problem with them, but that we don't end up with another travesty on our hands. So it's a sort of conundrum that while it was fully illegal, persons could have a fairly good livelihood. But once we begin to license and regulate, we run the danger that liberalization and so on might disempower and impoverish them. So these are the sort of issues. In terms of the political leadership, I do hope that these lessons that we know of persistent poverty that we learned in terms of sugar, bananas, and so on, that CARICOM considers these in terms of the roadmap going forward. So the end goal for CARICOM should be the dismantling of prohibition in its totality, replacing it with a strictly regulated framework, similar to what we have alcohol and tobacco, which are also harmful substances that are not criminalized. We should not maintain the status quo, but we do recognize that perhaps not all countries in the region are quite at that stage, which is why we said, we understand that there could be different approaches, but at the bottom line, minimal decriminalization, not putting people in jail. There are many ways you can approach it, but that's the bottom line. I don't know who will be first with the full legalization, but I'm pretty certain it will come probably very soon. Responsible controlled regime, um, education, very, very important, because we don't want when you change law, people to feel well it's a free up, especially the young people. We need to do a lot of work with the young people. As I told you, I met many young people and they are already using, and we don't want to create a glamour industry. But certainly that sort of regulation, who sells, how you sell, etc. And never forgetting, apart from the public health rationales, the human rights, social justice, and developmental perspectives, and of course the equity issues that I mentioned. Um, we felt that at least for now, cannabis should be banned from all public spaces, but there should be special provisions for the Rastafarian community. There are different models, and I know in Netherlands and these places you have these cafes, etc. But certainly that can be worked out with the Rastafarian community. But we felt that it should not just simply just, and of course we have done this already. We already done this with tobacco. When I was growing up, you could smoke anywhere, but now you can't just pull out your cigarette and smoke. So it's doable. But again, the education, and of course, the modality thus far that is seemingly favored is to allow persons a certain amount, small amount, and also a certain amount of plants to grow for themselves. And as I mentioned, we already have precedent from the courts that it is unconstitutional to prevent persons from growing it to self-medicate. So that's already there, so limited. And we also feel that public-private partnerships would be important, especially in terms of the cottage industry. So in conclusion, we have found in the Commission that there are deep rationales for law reform of what is a harmful, ineffective, and unjust prohibitionist legal regime that currently informs cannabis. Our findings are supported by strong public opinion, by credible scientific and empirical data analysis. And we feel that this gives enough legitimacy or justification for new laws, for a new framework, public health rights focus, which CARICOM heads of governments themselves embraced since 2002, even before the commission. So the time is ripe. We want impactful dynamic law reform. We want to consider our position as in terms of sustainable development goals, which we have embraced. And we consider again that social justice is a priority. We do not want to feel that the medical cannabis industry overtakes and we forget the warehousing and all of these people who are still being sent in jails and so on. So essentially, that's it in terms of what I'd like to say this morning. And thank you again for the opportunity. I wish you all the best in your deliberations, and I'm sure you will come to a very good law reform approach. I'm sorry I can't stay with you for the whole day, but I guess some of you know that I'm recuperating. So all the best and thank you so much. Not hearing.
Questions? Well, perhaps I could just, Minister David wants to ask a question. Perhaps you are hearing us, so we let him ask his question, and if you're hearing, you can respond.
It's just something that's been curious about. The islands who have passed legislation. Good morning, Commissioner, if you're there. The governments who have passed legislation, and we are considering to say that you can have 28 grams, 15 grams, and allow a couple of trees, some cases 3, some cases 4. What is the anticipation, what is the experience of where they are expected to get these ounces from? Unless it is anticipated that everybody who smokes is going to grow, then it must be purchased somewhere. So somebody will anticipate that market and set up a business. Entrepreneurial spirit is what we encourage. So what is the anticipated response to that? The person who says, okay, I want to buy an ounce, so I have to go somewhere to buy the ounce. I'm not interested in growing 5 trees. I don't want any marijuana trees in my yard or in my house, but I want to smoke. What is the expectation of those governments who have done that, and what has the experience so far for them in terms of the supply to the small smoker? That's my question.
Professor Antwine?
Okay, and can I ask the host to keep me, if you want, unmuted, because it's a little difficult for me to move my hands to mute and unmute. Yes, so that is actually one of the hanging questions in sort of the gray areas, because, for example, Trinidad, you can have the 30 grams and so, but because we have not as yet established a law as to who can grow, who can sell, and so on. The law is silent. It turns a blind eye. So really and truly, it means that you will still be getting it from a so-called illegal source. But at this point in time, unless you have both sides to the equation dealing with the supply, then that is exactly what had happened. Of course, in Jamaica, it's different because they already established laws to, as to how to supply. You get a license, etc., etc. But
So,
you're quite right.
Sorry. I was going to ask, what is your recommendation with respect to that?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Did you hear the question, Professor? What is
Oh,
your
I didn't hear you.
recommendation? Do you have a recommendation with regard to that?
So I think although we recognize that that is a deficiency, that you say nothing about where to get it, because of the urgency of this, and people still getting arrested every day, I think it is best to go. Why I say this is it's not as simple to create those laws for industry. It's not as simple. You could create the laws for industry at the same time, understanding that you will have to make amendments. And the law is very fluid in all of these countries that have done this. Jamaica, even Antigua had to do some changes and so forth. You could do that, recognizing and telling your population is not a perfect solution yet. You know, but the simpler way really is to just simply do the decriminalization bit so that people can get relief. And that would really be the social justice issue there, that you want to prevent people from being, because the police will do their jobs. You cannot tell the police do not arrest somebody if the law book says that you're committing an offense. Yeah. And actually that happened in St. Vincent, because I had warned my colleagues in St. Vincent. They went the other way to create a medical without decriminalizing. And they said, oh, there's going to be an amnesty. We told all the police not to arrest. Well, first of all, that is wrong. You cannot tell the police not to arrest. That's against the rule of law. But not only that, as predicted, some police decided to arrest somebody. I think there was a political overtone. So that is not a good solution. So it is better to have, first of all, if you're not quite ready with the industry bit and the licensing bit, which is not simple, let me warn you. If you're not ready with that, to at least give people some relief for the small amounts. Yeah, I would say that, because the licensing does require, it is fairly complex, especially if you consider the issues I mentioned about traditional growers. Now, if Grenada, think about it this way, if Grenada is thinking about medical cannabis, one of the problems is that if you kind of open up the licensing regime as you should, these businesses don't want that, because obviously it helps them to have a sort of a monopoly over the licensing. You see, because they don't want competition on the ground, etc. So these are the kind of hard questions that politicians have to make, because you may want to say, okay, I want to employ 100 people, as the case may be. So they are not easy issues, but I would recommend, in the short term at least, that you have this sort of relief, give people relief from being arrested and thrown in jail at that point.
Okay, we have other opportunities for questions, so I'll take two more questions before we allow this part of our day to close off. So there's a question, the brother at the mic, and then there was another brother at the very back there. Has he gone? All right, well, the brother who just came in, you had your hand up as well? Oh, okay, so just the brother at the mic is the one question that we have before we close off this session.
Good. Chair, thank you very much for a splendid report and for your presentation this morning. My question rides on that of the just concluded question by the Minister. Given the dynamic that we are seeing playing out and some of the challenges that might be posed by decriminalization and the policing infrastructure around it, how would you, rather, we'd like to hear your comments on that approach, the decriminalization versus legalization at this point. If you can just comment on the two approaches, yes, decriminalization versus legalization.
But I must give a disclaimer, this is my personal opinion. And in the commission, the majority of us were in favor of legalization, but it was not unanimous. But unanimously, we agreed to decriminalization. There were still one or two people, I think probably two people, who felt, we're not ready for it. And actually, the reasons were because they felt people will overdo it, sort of thing. Not because they weren't convinced about the arguments, but they just felt, we're not ready, sort of thing. But the majority of us, including my colleague, Assistant Commissioner of Police, including the pastor, interesting enough, and certainly me. So my own personal opinion, I believe we should just legalize it. But as I would always say, legalization does not mean liberalization necessarily. And again, we have the examples of alcohol and tobacco. They are legal, but they are regulated. So I would not say unregulated. but I would say legalized, but within a regulated framework. That is my preference when I look at all of the evidence, including, the fact that the decriminalization issue still exposes in terms of the amounts and also the issues I mentioned in terms of finance and banking. But I must stress it's my personal opinion. What the Commission in the short term felt as a unanimous view was the minimum decriminalization. But the majority of us, but we certainly felt, even those who said decriminalization, I should say, felt that in the long term it should be legalization, but they weren't sure whether right now Caribbean people were ready for the total legalization.
Professor Antoine, Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine, I cannot thank you enough for what you have contributed to the beginning of today. You've been absolutely magnificent. As the Dean of a law school, perhaps some of us expected you to give us a legal presentation, but you've given us, could I say, a human presentation? A presentation in which everything that you said seems so relevant to what we ourselves were thinking. And I really want to thank you for this, and I promise you that the two groups that have sponsored today will make sure that your presentation gets the widest possible dissemination in Grenada. I challenge myself, and I want to challenge you, if you know of anybody who has already done anything that could help the churches especially to come to grips with this issue. How do we speak truth to righteousness is a problem, because a lot of people in their righteousness don't listen to the truth. So I am prepared, and I just put it to you to think about. I'll certainly contact you about it later on. I'm prepared that perhaps we can collaborate, the Conference of Churches Grenada and yourself, in preparing a document that we could allow the churches to use throughout the region. Thank you again. I didn't say it at the beginning, but she was operating under certain health constraints, and we have to thank her doubly because she didn't allow those constraints to in any way minimize the quality of her contribution. So, Professor, thank you.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Brothers and sisters, we move on to the next item on the agenda. If anybody wants to stretch, feel free to do so. There's some water at the back if you need some water. But now I want to invite Reverend Prescott, who spoke earlier, to introduce the moderator of the next panel.
Thank you, Bishop Harvey. We continue our discussion as it relates to the legalization, decriminalization of marijuana. We are now going to move into our first of the roundtable, which we will be having today. The first roundtable will feature discussions on related to health, children, youth, and other social considerations. Our moderator for this discussion would be Mrs. Cheryl Curtin. Mrs. Curtin, or Miss Curtin, is a former teacher who served as Executive Director of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce. Also, she has recently retired as a Human Resource Manager for George F. Huggins and Company. She also served as served the board of directors as board of director on various institutions, both business and voluntary sector. Continues to be very involved in the activities of her church and other social development initiatives. Ms. Curtin, we welcome you to our our panel this morning, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion. We welcome you. You can sit if you want to just present the panel. Okay.
We only have one panel in person, one panelist in person, 4 coming via Zoom.
Okay. So you were just in the queue.
Good morning to everybody present and to those listening via Zoom. Our first panel this morning is going to be talking about the health issues and the health implications of the legalization of marijuana, or as some people refer to call it, the holy herb. We have 3 panelists, 2 of whom will join us via Zoom. One is present here this morning. They will make their presentations, and then there will be a period for questions and answers. They can ask each other questions, seek clarification, make comments, and of course, the public who are watching via Zoom and you who are present here will also be free to make your comments or to ask questions. The presentations will follow one after the other, and then the questions will be taken. So please make notes after each speaker has spoken so you don't forget what you want to say at the end. It's expected that the discussion, the panelists will be approximately 10 minutes long. Each of them will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then the discussion will follow. So our first presenter this morning is Dr. Wendy Crawford Daniel. She's a research sociologist and professor of social sciences at St. George's University. She achieved a PhD in sociology from Temple University in the United States. In addition to her teaching, she is a social researcher, an activist, and an advocate for the social development of Grenada. Her social research includes research on drugs, alcohol, and marijuana use among the prison populations in the OECS, and she collaborates closely with the Grenada Drug Epidemiology Network. Dr. Crawford's research covers a wide range of social economic topics, including aging, juvenile justice, disabilities, poverty, gender, and quality of life. She holds membership in several community organizations and serves on the board of directors of the Grenada Save the Children's Fund and the Hilarion Home. She's also an author who has penned 2 docu-novels on the social and cultural life of Grenada. Please welcome to the podium Dr. Wendy Crawford Daniel. You sit down. She will stay seated.
I hope it's okay if I can stay seated. All right, great. Dr. Antoine, others listening through Zoom, and persons present here today, good morning. It's a very hard act to follow, having listened to such a thorough and well-presented report of the CARICOM report on marijuana. My role is to present some of the social issues and the social implication of marijuana use. Now, as I thought about the presentation, and I listened to what Dr. Antoine presented today, I felt very pleased that we have gotten to this point. Now, here in Grenada, if some of you are old enough to remember, Grenada really should be leading the rest of CARICOM with regards to our attitude towards marijuana. I recall as a child, even in the very early period of prior to the revolution, the New Drill movement used the, should I say, decriminalization of certain quantity of marijuana as a platform to attract the young people who had the knowledge and wisdom at the time of of marijuana use. And so when the revolution occurred, a level of liberalization, not liberalization, but decriminalization of small quantities of marijuana, I think, was allowed until, for a very short period though, because things changed very quickly, and we saw that freeing up that occurred at a very early period of the revolution changed. And I'm sure at some point research will be done, particularly around the Rastafarian community, since they felt the brunt of that change in attitude towards decriminalizing marijuana. And that was over 40 years ago. So we really should be leading the Caribbean if we had continued along that path with regards to our attitude towards marijuana. So in discussing this morning the human and social impact of marijuana use, I will focus on this presentation on 3 aspects. I will not get into the fine details of the social implications so much, but more throwing out some theoretical ideas that will give us reason to think about some issues with regards to marijuana. So I would look at the social impact, of course, of our drug policy, the social impact of marijuana use among youth and children, and the social implication of decriminalization of marijuana, with a focus on the pros and cons. Of course, as we know, all situations will have those. But before I even touch on that, I would like to place my discussion within a historical and a sociological context, one that influenced the form and the intensity of the social impact of any drug, but keeping my focus on marijuana. When we look at the history and the evolution of our definition, or the meaning, our perception, and the basis for our perception and the designation of marijuana as a drug, herein lies much of our problem. It clearly shows the origin of our negative perception. Designation, language means a lot. Designation, how we define concepts, extremely important in creating our perception and attitude towards that particular phenomena. So when marijuana is perceived as a drug, the connotation and the negativity we see, and that may have marked the decriminalization effort, or in other words, that sort of definition has made the sort of decriminalizing effort underway very challenging and very difficult. Research has shown that marijuana historically was not always considered a drug. It was not always criminalized, and the designation and the demonization of marijuana as a drug was imposed on this region. This imposition by the colonial exploiters, in our case the British, in the 1930s, has more to do with the Eurocentric view of the world, that they are the center of the universe, and they were morally, ethically, and spiritually superior to the people of this region, and their capitalistic goal and the exercise of the acquired colonial power on the will of the people of this region. So their designation prevailed despite the region's long history of marijuana as traditional medicine, also used in religious rituals and rites of passage, and as a therapeutic treatment in meditation, in relaxation and enjoyment, in communications, and very importantly, in communication with ancestors or ancestral communication. It was used in social gatherings and in the communal life of our people. And I listened to Dr. Antoine's report this morning, and according to the CARICOM Commission on Marijuana, It was brought to this region by the indentured servants of Asia, specifically the Indians, who use it in spiritual rituals, and later adopted by the Rastafarian movement, who viewed it, according to the Commission, as a gift of nature from God, used in prayers and other spiritual practices. This is the sacred and positive perception that existed about marijuana. What that history has taught us is that marijuana held deep historical, cultural, medical, and social significance for the people of the Caribbean. Over time, and in cooperation with key agents of socialization in our culture, our education system, our churches, our legal system, we were made to internalize and embrace the British designation and criminalization of marijuana through, it was called the United Kingdom Dangerous Drug Ordinance of 1937, and which was enshrined into our laws in Grenada. It is this criminal designation and an imposed law that could be credited for the many social problems that emerged as local people were stripped of their right to practice their religion and their rituals. The other context in which I want to discuss its human and social implication is a cultural context within which our attitude towards marijuana has been nurtured and developed. Consciously embedded in our socialization, again, in our education, and so we see the importance of education if we're to undertake any measure with regards to marijuana, whether at school, church, or any other social institution, was a deliberate attempt to manipulate us into internalizing marijuana as a dangerous drug, reinforced further by US drug policy for the region and the war on drugs, and subsuming marijuana that we consider a herb and they consider a drug, subsuming our herb into their war on drugs, in which marijuana being their main focus in the region, and we blindly followed, and because we are blindly following our many of our political leaders in CARICOM who do not have the political balls to do what is right, and so who obediently, sorry, Father, in the region, and blindly followed by our leaders who obediently grant permission to others to chart the direction for our society, and even today we see that situation prevailing. Now, the case has been made for decriminalization according to the stats from research as contained in the same CARICOM Commission's report that Dr. Antoine just reported on. The attitude towards decriminalization has gained traction, however, throughout the region, and Grenada is no exception. This growing change in perception of marijuana may be the result of several factors, social factors, including the role of science in providing the evidence to challenge previous negative perceptions and beliefs about marijuana. Knowledge and information about marijuana has become more readily accessible to all through the internet. Education about marijuana and drugs has shown it as not more harmful than any other controlled or even uncontrolled substances as alcohol, coffee, tobacco, nutmeg, barbandi, and all the things that we know, and many of the traditional herbs or regularly used plants and herbs in this region. Technology has put at our fingertip any of the information we want to know about marijuana and other drugs. So access to information, data, and statistics show us how the very countries that have criminalized marijuana in our region use our country, marijuana use in our countries are legitimately making big profits from the marijuana industry. And all that information is right before us at our fingertip to see. So the hypocrisy of the situation is very alarming. Access to data, stats, and policy positions on marijuana shows us bias. We're able to see all the biases, all the inequalities and prejudices in the patterns of arrests, in the patterns of conviction, in the patterns of punishment, in the patterns of imprisonment for marijuana. And the contrast is very clear for us to see. It is evident from the data and statistics that the system is biased to disproportionately punish the most vulnerable people in our society. And I was happy to hear in the report from Dr. Antoine attention to that issue. Like everything else in the social world, nothing is static. Nothing remains the same. Everything evolves. Everything changes, including definitions, including perceptions, attitudes, and ultimately regulations and policies will face a similar situation. We know that everything has relative pros and cons, or negative and positive implications. That is often very time sensitive. Nothing remains the same. And that when we look at the social world, that is one of the that guides the direction of the social world, and understanding that nothing remains the same. So the very position that was held, the very definition of being a drug that was given to marijuana or imposed on marijuana, even that will come to pass. And it has already begun. So there is a level of legitimacy and need for concern in the argument of those of those who argue against decriminalization, with concerns particularly for young people and children. And again, those concerns were addressed this morning in the report. And those especially who may have adverse reaction to marijuana use. Those arguments for keeping criminalization or against decriminalization emphasize the importance of children, young people, and users with adverse effects. So therefore, while we may argue in favor of removing marijuana from that categorization or from the definition of being a drug and having it considered a herb, while we do all of that, it is important also to look at some of the issues that's often highlighted against marijuana. So it is important also to be aware of the issues raised by others who argue against such an act. So there is the belief that marijuana use often causes increased conflict with family and friends. There is also the belief that users risk having poor judgment. Also that marijuana use often results in problems with the law and a projected association with continued criminal behavior. I'm really happy this morning when I heard the refuting of many of these issues when Dr. Antoine made her presentation. Many see marijuana use as an introduction into criminal behavior with increasing difficulty to get off that path. It is also perceived to increase anxiety among young people, feelings of discomfort in social situations. Also, many speak of the financial strain to maintain if it becomes a habit. the habitual use. Others look at the issue, and again addressed this morning, how it affects education and ability to stay in school and secure and stay in employment. I guess that's why their concern and particular attention is being paid to what will be the situation or what will be the decision with regards to children when that decriminalization effort comes into being. There is also the perception that the use of marijuana is the first stage in a life with harder drugs and the involvement of criminal activities to acquire marijuana and other drugs if that's the case. But there are a lot of generalizations of those about, and often made as if marijuana use have the same outcome for everyone. So people make generalization about outcomes and often interpret it as being a situation that will exist across the board. So equally as there are cons or there are negative consequences or negative impact or perceived negative impact, there are also reported and recorded pros for marijuana use, including much of which was presented earlier on, including some research report that some users become even more social and outgoing. Some experience decreased anxiety and decreased stress and reduce discomfort in social setting. And so when we think of this, your social life, which is basically comprises your interaction and relationship with friends and family, etc., we can see within the con a very positive impact on the social life according to research in marijuana use. As the presentation was being made this morning, I recall some years ago, I was undertaking a research project at Her Majesty's Prison, and the idea of the project was to see if there was a link between marijuana use and violent crime among persons in Grenada. And that research took me to the prison where I had to interview several guys who were both on remand and charged for various drug-related crimes. And in the designation, it was an OECS sort of study. So it was a study that took place in all of the countries in the OECS. And I was doing the Grenada leg and went to the prison to interview some of the guys up there. And one of the first things that they would say to me is, because drug, do not call it a drug, it's not a drug. If you do not change that term immediately, I will not be taking part in this. Right? So I had to quickly make the switch and inform the organizers of the research about that comment. But more importantly, what many of them made that's a comment to me in different forms, but meaning the same thing. They would say, you will know, you can know when there is ganja here at the prison. We are peaceful, we meditate. There is no fight, there is no argument, there is no low talking. We retreat and we meditate. When there is no ganja, up here is like a war zone. So there is some value, and it was a sort of common comment through. I said, I wonder if they discussed that before coming to me, that it seemed to be such a common thread in the response. But that's just to say that you know, the whole idea of from the social world, the whole idea of the definition, how we define, have a lot to do with how we think about certain things. And that point and that issue that they raised at the prison brought home that issue to me more than anything else. That very designation creates a very negative perception and immediately is perceived with violent crime. So the very formulation of the research question was embedded with stereotypes and that type of thing. So I want to end without going much further because we have limited time. I'll say sociologically, marijuana has a long history of use in many religious, ethnic, and cultural traditions in the region. The focus of our policymakers and regulators should be to pay attention to the shifting perception within the culture and begin the necessary social and health provisions for those who could be adversely affected by the use of, and basically age-based regulation to protect children, in addition to extensive education about marijuana based on scientific facts and not on moral authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford Daniel. It's not pushed. Just press it. Yeah. Hello. I pressed. It's on. Thank you, Dr. Crawford Daniel. So we heard some of the social implications and ramifications of the whole marijuana issue. The pros and the cons, some of the things we have to be considered, that we must consider when we have discussions on the way forward. We're being joined next by a Zoom, as I mentioned, by Dr. Umawale and Mulero Marshall. Have we made contact with him? Let me tell you something about him. He is originally from the Republic of Guyana. He is Professor Emeritus of Public Health and Preventative Medicine at St. George's University. He is immediate past president of the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations. CAMPA is the acronym. He has been chief psychologist of narcotic addiction Boston City Hospital in the 70s and 80s, and then later in the 80s and 90s. He's a consultant psychologist, youth education stroke prevention program at Diamond Community Health Center, alcoholism programs in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He's a director, Cork Institute on Black Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse at the Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also been a consultant psychologist of community substance abuse programs at the Georgia Regional Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. And most recently, in the 20s, it says, member of the Expert Council of the OAS stroke CICAD PROCA Training and Certification Program for Caribbean Drug Treatment and Prevention Personnel. He's also a Global Master Trainer, Universal Treatment Curriculum, a collaboration of the Colombo Plan, the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission of the OAS, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs of the U.S. State Department. So as you have heard, Dr. Umawale Amuleru Marshall has a broad background in dealing with narcotics, and though we're not calling marijuana a narcotic really, but his experience should give us a good insight into what we're looking here. So please welcome Dr. Umawale Amuleru Marshall.
Honorable ministers of the government, especially my old friend, Peter David, other parliamentarians, members of the clergy, activists, academic colleagues, and particularly my friends, Wendy Crawford, Dr. Prabhakar Narasimhan, and others whom I can't see, but I'm sure there are others in the audience who are comrades and friends, academic colleagues, really Caribbean comrades all. I am pleased to be a part of this discussion. And won't take too long because I don't know that it makes sense for me to indulge in redundancy. This report is so comprehensive. So comprehensive. It reaches across, I would argue, most of the relevant foci that any discussion of this nature would want to bring into focus. It is also richly evidence-based and balanced. There's nothing I can contribute to the discussion that isn't already a part of this report. I am extremely pleased and proud that this is a product of CARICOM, of our region. It's eminently useful and ought to be promulgated widely. I'll do my part through CANPA to ensure that it's disseminated so that people know what our decision makers are contemplating and the kind of scholarship that stands potentially behind those decisions. And while making those observations, I want to take a moment to compliment Professor Antoine on the behalf of her commission, because this product was produced by them, and it reflects a lot of work. And everybody is busy. Everybody is busy, even in this moment of COVID. So I feel extremely comfortable saying that Professor Antoine, what you and your colleagues on the commission have produced should provide our political directorate, our academicians, our policymakers, and even community activists, because we don't want to do anything. This is a problem. When I take a moment to talk about public health, I'll return to this. We don't want to do anything that does not reflect a broadly democratic participatory arrangement with communities. The only thing I would say about, but even before I go there, let me also lean into the positive. The fact that this is a regional initiative also excites me. I will not live long enough to see a richer, a fuller integration of the Caribbean, at least the CARICOM sub-region. But I aspire to a day when this would become really more like one state, a multi-state country, and less like this loose arrangement of sovereign nations. But it is sovereignty that I want to draw on as a sort of criticism, because we are late. I'm not sure that I understand. I'm not particularly educated about the treaty obligations, the constraints that our political directorate work with regard to international financing, and so on. I'm sure there are constraints that force them to comply with Big Brother. So let me make that concession before I say what I'm about to say. I just don't understand why we have to wait for America and Canada and Europe before we express the sovereignty we claim. We need to be more self-determining as a region. We are late. So in the interest of transparency, I want to declare that I've been for many, many years, for decades, both in the United States and in our region, fully comfortable with the advocacy for decriminalization and, in some cases, legalization of these substances. I'm a public health professional, and I have to say that public health looks at these so-called problems. We look at these conditions from a harm reduction analytical perspective. All of it. And the basic intuitive arguments that we make don't require a great deal of expertise and scholarship. It's common sense. If the solution or the consequence, the legal official consequence, even the clinical response to a problem is more harmful than the problem, we go with that option that reduces harm. And so it seemed quite obvious to me, for I was a young person in this discipline, that the consequences of criminalization far exceeded any suspected or scientifically defended side effects, negative consequences associated with these practices, and particularly marijuana. So colleagues, I'm excited that we're moving in this direction. I heard Minister David, in his opening remarks, really talk about a sort of continuum, a kind of progression from decriminalization to legalization. And I understand that we are a compendium of sovereign states, and so every island, every country gets to move at its own pace. But I think at least at the level of decriminalization, we should be able to nurture a consensus across the region. I would ask, though, that as we do that, we try to democratize our discussions. We try to create a space for patient presentation of these issues. This report, this commission's report, gives us all of the information we could possibly need to do that. But we need to do the work. We need to ensure that everyone in various sectors of our societies understand this particular subject. The work is already done. All we have to do is the dissemination. And I would encourage us to do that across our society, and to not assume that there are any of us, for religious, educational, socioeconomic, regional, esoteric reasons, who are not able to consume this stuff, who would not be interested in participating. Let us democratize the discussion. Now, colleagues, I know something about public health. I don't know anything about the treaties that the political directorate work with. I don't know anything about even the economics, and I would leave to my medical colleagues the analysis and discussion of the medical uses of marijuana. Even if there are side effects there, though, I would merely remind us that there is no pharmaceutical treatment for which there are no side effects. But let's talk a little bit about public health, because the document and other documents, the increasing slogan now is, we are going to assume a public health and human rights orientation. We're going to assume a public health and human rights orientation as we move away, ease away from the criminal justice one. Well, public health, in order to really resemble that discipline, that movement, that tradition, must do more than respond to problems. Public health is really not about therapy, reaction, irrespective of how efficacious and immediate that clinical response is. Public health is not in the first instance about responding to problems, designated problems. It really has more to do with cultivating human beingness, working to produce at multiple ecologies, at multiple levels, from the micro all the way to the macro, which is at the societal and, for our purposes, the regional, at least the CARICOM region. Conditions in which human beings can become more human. We call that well-being. And we say we want to do that with a biopsychosocial perspective, which is to say, for us, health is not just about the body. It's not just about diseases. In fact, the definition that we work with of health argues that it has very little to do with disease. It has more to do with an optimal attainment of physical, psychological, and social well-being. And we're not even sure what that would look like when we get there. So it's a continuous negotiation. But we are committed to the reduction in disparities, inequity. We are impatient and intolerant of structural inequity. So we're talking about, for example, universal health coverage. Not simply a comprehensive package of medical treatments, which is where people sometimes go in misconstruction. We're talking about the availability of whatever your package of physical, psychological, and social protections and corrections are. Small country, small economy, you may not have nearly the kind of package that one gets in Australia or in America, but whatever is available to anybody in a society must be available to everybody without barriers. That is to say, without cost, out-of-pocket cost, without physical, cultural, regional barriers. So even though that sounds idealistic, what we are saying is that we work all the time to find them and to attack them so that we are constantly reducing impediments to access. So if you're going to have a public health oriented policy, that policy has to be driven by that mission. You want to broaden participation in decision making and governance. You want to ensure that communities are empowered to say something about the services they get, and that communities everywhere, irrespective of whether they are rural or urban, have equitable access. At a minimum, if you can't put the same structure, the same multidisciplinary team close to them, you can provide transportation. You can get them from where they are to where they need to go. We want to be sure that there is increasing equity in access. But as I'm speaking about equity, I want to also say to you that this is not revolutionary, although it comes with some revolutions. Grenada had an early start that many of us thought was quite promising. Not perfect. But as Barack Obama used to remind us when he was president all the time, we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We want to work on social determinants. I think Dr. Crawford mentioned poverty and unemployment, miseducation and maleducation. These are factors that increase vulnerability not only to problems associated with substance use disorders, but a wider range of problems. And the same people who are found prevalently in this particular problem or that particular problem tend to be the same people that we would measure at high risk on a range of issues, which argues that what makes them vulnerable is not the little microcosmic individually anchored behavioral choices that we tend to focus on. Has more to do with their placement, their zip code, their neighborhood, the circumstances of their community. So colleagues, when we sit down to talk about a public health orientation or a human rights orientation, we have to understand this means much more than simply decriminalizing and offering treatment. And a quick word about treatment. It has to be on demand. It has to be on demand. Whenever there is a need, there ought to be competent professional services available to everyone without the barrier of cost. This is a function of universal health coverage, our ability to provide health care, because health is not a privilege, it's not a commodity. It is an absolute human right. It's an inalienable human right. I may have thought before that I would say a lot more than I have said, but I have a way of speaking extemporaneously, and I know I've consumed my time. Thank you.
And now we're going to we're going to listen to Dr. Narashman Prabhakar. I have it right? Voice is Prahi. Dr. Prabhakar is a professor at St. George's University, attached to the Department of Clinical Teaching and Psychiatry. He's been there for about 20 years. He was seconded to the Ministry of Health here in Grenada. He is clerkship director for the 3rd and 4th year medical students in psychiatry. And he's had many years of experience in rehabilitation of folks who have become addicted to drugs and alcohol in the state of Grenada. And he was involved with Carlton House since its inception in 1984. So we welcome now through Zoom, Dr. Prabhakar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's a great opportunity for me to be with such important people in the Caribbean. And also, you give me an opportunity to be without a mask. In the past 9 months, I've been wearing masks and nobody recognized me. At least now people would recognize me. Thank you so much. Right. I was praying to God not to put me after Dr. Omawali. Please don't do it, but it happened. So it becomes so difficult for me to say anything after him. I'm going to say it anyway. Okay, thanks. I'm just going to say it. Right. Before doing anything, I have to mention 3 names in the Caribbean who were my mentors in the University of West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. Professor Michael Bobran, Dr. George Mahy, and Dr. Hickling. These are my mentors way back in the 80s. So without whose guidance, I wouldn't be here talking to you. So I have to mention those names before any of these little chats with the public in the Caribbean. Again, everything has been said. There is nothing for me to say it now. It's just that the commission has put forth one of the best reports. and everything is already written. All we have to do is maybe just discuss it and say, okay, we'll let it go. My only concern would be to legalize this drug. I don't mind doing the other thing, because we still have some problems. You see, as Dr. Omawali said, he likes to talk about the society in general, whereas I would like to talk about people in particular. For a reason. I will tell you why. Because I have seen in the past, I've been here for 40 years, and I have seen so many mothers and so many fathers and so many families who come to me. We are not talking about the patients themselves, you know. We are talking about the parents of these people and what happens to them, how they suffer. Not because somebody is smoking marijuana, not because somebody is sick, but because of the behaviors of such people. For whatever reason, it is said that marijuana smoking is not necessarily a disease by itself. It's people who already have a disease might be smoking this drug, and maybe it causes the problems it does. It is definitely possible. But one question I have for you guys. I've seen hundreds of people who smoke marijuana only once, get into trouble, and then get out of trouble and never smoke again, and they're okay for the rest of their life. What do you think about it? I'm not blaming anything, you know. Please don't mistake me. I'm with you guys. This is the only problem I have with this. Or drug, sensimania, whatever you call it. Right? It is the people, it is the family that has problems, and not necessarily the particular person. Now, of course, the hospital is overcrowded. It is true. I'm not saying it's all because of marijuana, but in a ward round of 20 people, 17 people smoke marijuana. I'm not saying it's all because of marijuana, but they might have underlying disorders, underlying psychiatric disorders, personality disorders. And maybe they smoke and their disease is exacerbated. It is definitely possible. But please, let us think. Somebody said research and then legalize, or legalize and then research. How do we do it? I leave it to you guys, because I'm not a policymaker. I still feel a little bit of research is needed before we completely legalize this drug. All right? It's hard for me to say anything beyond this. The Commission has done a marvelous job, and I want to congratulate them, and I agree with 99% of what they have said. Thank you so much. Next time, please send me before Omawali. Thank you, guys.
Each other. You here in front of me can make any points you wish to make, and we're inviting people who may be watching on Zoom also to be part of this discussion if they wish to contribute in any way. Now is the time, at least for the first session. Anybody saying anything? I agree that the presentations were pretty thorough, but you may just have something you wish to clarify.
Yes, the last speaker said something very important. It's very, very important that most times people say marijuana bring problems or bring disease, give mental problem. But as he has explained, and I've been saying that for ages, marijuana doesn't affect anybody mentally. It's based on your personal lifestyle, maybe family, something you inherit, some disease you inherit from your family, or some other disease you may have, comes up after smoking marijuana. But marijuana itself will never and has not created no side effect. I've been smoking marijuana since about 11 years old. And I was told about 9 years old that I has a mental problem. I wasn't forced to do anything educationally because my mother had feared that mental problem escalate. But I did my thing undercover when marijuana was introduced to me as a youth. And from since that time to this time, marijuana has inspired me, has grown me, has fed me, give me a family, give me everything I have. So I guess as much we must take the right approach in re-educating, as Dr. Waterly said, re-educating the people of Grenada especially. I've been on that issue for a very long time, my whole life. Since a little boy, I see myself as this thing should be legalized. It should be legalized. The time, as we said, for decriminalization has totally passed. In 2009, the Nabingi House of Grenada, we went to the government and tell them about the legalization of marijuana. And they saw it as a big joke. You know, they never saw the importance, they never saw the spiritual benefit, they never saw the economic, they never saw nothing. As Dr. Waterly said, we look at the big guys out there and listen to them, and they destroy our policies that should be going forward. So in this case and this morning, I feel so happy and so revived with this issue that I pray the re-education about the herb, as the lady said, they call it a drug. I never call marijuana a drug. I always see it as a pleasant herb which healed me over the years. So a proper stream of education must be done before legalization. As I said, I have a post, I couldn't come with it this morning because I was so excited to reach here this morning. I left it, legalization with regulation. And I have that for years, going about like a madman in Grenada. Oh, you're looking for marijuana to legalize, and that will never happen, and you don't hear what the Prime Minister said. But I knew what the Prime Minister said was very naive. He was very naive in his position, because he didn't want to listen to his people. More or less, he was listening to different people. So today now, we find ourselves at the backstage when we should be at the front stage. Yeah. Because, as I said, marijuana should be legalized in Grenada between 2005.
Well, hopefully we'll get there.
And decriminalized. So right now, we're past the stage, so we're looking for legalization.
Okay, one thing at a time. Yes, Bishop.
I forgot to mention earlier on that when we come into the microphone to speak, please say who you are, because that helps our record. Okay, folks?
Yeah.
Good. I have one thing to put on the table. I've heard about marijuana as different things, but I haven't heard anything about marijuana or cannabis as a weapon. And what I mean by that is that my experience in Trinidad in 1970, when young black men in the ghetto marched on the streets of Port of Spain, I never quite understood what brought that to an end very suddenly. And then I went to study in Oakland, California in the 1980s. And I met a number of people there who remembered the leader of that social revolution, Daga, Geddes Granger. And they remembered Daga coming to visit a guy called Huey Newton, who was the leader of the Black Panthers. And when he shared with Huey what was going on, in the Caribbean, Black Power. He told them, by the time you get back to your country, marijuana will be on every block in Port of Spain. And when Daga got back to Port of Spain, marijuana was in fact on every block. And when Professor Antoine used the word chiller, it gave me a word on which I could hang part of what I have to say today. Because as a chiller, my sense is now that it has been used against people of African descent to chill us, so that we never become angry enough to make the social changes that are needed in the region. And I wonder, I'd really like to see that discussed at some point, because Daga confirmed for me that that is what happened, right? But I don't know if it's happened in other situations. And from that perspective, I see marijuana as a weapon of war, but it is a war against Caribbean people, especially Caribbean males, through their emasculation and their chilling out.
Thank you, Bishop. It's a very good point for us to ponder. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that or make any comments. Okay, remember to say your name and who you represent, if you do represent any group.
Good day, my beloved. I'm Ivor Taifara from the House of Inayabingi. I'm thankful to see all the beautiful sisters are here. Minister Peter David, Honorable Peter David, Sister Sandra Ferguson, Pastor Harvey, Sister Crawford, a member of those panels who have spoken to us earlier on, have given greater insight and information, which the Rastaman have shared the same information for many years. Put into Pastor Harvey's remarks, we spoke about marijuana using as a tool of war. Well, you see, marijuana have always used as a tool of war, because people have spoken ill against marijuana. So you have created that fear, reverse psychology, that it have created that fear, a stigma for the people's beliefs for the use of marijuana as a very harmful and dangerous drug. Because today, in the world that we live in today, if we recognize in the world today, many things that help aid and assist the people. The system, which is basically the European system, which the Rastaman have recognized for many years. The authorities that be have created a negative impact towards the Rastafari people, and also those other spiritual nations who are involved in the smoking of herb, or even not just smoking herb alone too, but in ancient practices for clothing, for food, for oils, for medicine. See, marijuana is not a secret to the world, Marijuana has been always there with the people for centuries. But because, as we have all spoken earlier on, and many of the professionals, even learned people, scholars, Sister Crawford have spoken, Sister, one of them Trinidad, Sister Antoine. See, this is data facts, you see, because there's nothing no more secret about marijuana. No more marijuana is there, visible for the world to recognize the truth about marijuana, the potential truth. But it's all because of the European domination of this herb. You see, because they have created an environment in the 1930s, well, basically from 1935, by the term that the system created now, petroleum. The discovery of petroleum was DuPont in 1935 have brought to the forefront, but yet still, they were greedy industrialists and wealthy shareholders who wished to suppress marijuana in that light. So they created a whole lot of propaganda schemes around marijuana to create that, which is the weapon, which Pastor Harvey was speaking about, was the weapon. Is the ill information, which is really the weapon to discourage and give marijuana that negative image. And even the church at one particular time, which the Rastaman have recognized also, historically it is there. Because not only that the Rastaman speak about marijuana is a lie. The Rastaman always try in every particular way to highlight the truth to the people. And all these histories are there. So why do they persecute the marijuana and also the Rasta people in this particular time when all the facts are there? So these are the weapons they use now. Poor information, lies to discredit our fellow brothers, our loved ones, and those who use the herb, not just for smoking purposes, but for many purposes, because today we look at the European countries, Australia for many years. I've been working day as night, producing many, many products for marijuana. But beautiful fabrics, they use in the agriculture to maintain the erosion of lands. In France, I've used it for many years, for paper making, for cigarette smoking, and all the different uses. But you see, what we are focused on, basically, in these islands here, is the smoking purpose of the marijuana, which the Rastaman and many of the Hindu institutions have used it for many years in these islands here. And because it's a weapon to keep the people in a state of poverty and backwardness, that have suppressed the herb for so many years. And make it now, it's a racial war as well too, you know, because to get the marijuana in 1937 off on a blacklist was propaganda wars, which they tell the people that the Spanish, which is the Mexicans, or the Hispanic, and the blacks will use the marijuana to get involved sexual intercourse with the European ladies. So they got many of these European racist groups involved in it to stand against it. And that's why up to this day, it's not even 100 years that marijuana has been looked down in that particular way. And it's because of these racial laws to make a handful of wealthy men remain in power and dominate the ganja industry up to this day. So if we, the Rasta people, and those who share that sentiment towards marijuana don't stand up in these times, but we got to stand up on our own islands and we got to put away those Europeans' ideals and the way of life of that we sow these negative light upon marijuana, which we as Caribbean people do follow their ways. We're not thinking for our own self. It all comes down to education, as all the Rasta Virgin have made mention, and many of those speakers today have spoken about it because everybody are aware that the problems affecting people is lack of education of the truth. The essence of all things, the truth. Right. You know? So, my dear beloved, I just give thanks to be in this panel today that we can represent and speak of ganja, but we need to have it at more length and more greater depth where we can express ourselves in the true sense of the people of Grenada, CARICOM, Martinique, and the rest of the Eastern Caribbean and the wider world. Right. So, my dear beloved, just give thanks to be a part of this panel.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just kind of wrap up this session. Of course, this event today, unless there's somebody else who has a pressing point, okay, it's not really a consultation, quote unquote, it's an opportunity to start this self-awareness or the community education program. Because as we have heard from the previous speakers, especially from the report by Dr. and Professor Antoine, the need for education of the public is key because it's not a completely simple and straightforward issue. There are different aspects to be discussed, to be understood. I mean, we know that the smoking of the herb doesn't make you drop out of society necessarily, but we also know that if you have other complications of poor nutrition, what some of the more unsavory aspects could be. So the idea of today's discussion is to have people express their views, open the way for public consultation, so there's a concern in that government would draft legislation before they've actually spoken to people and got some feedback to prevent amendment after amendment after amendment. I thought the discussions would come first and then the legislation would be drafted. But be that as it may, according to Minister David, they have drafted legislation. It's going to be put out to the public for discussion. We have heard this morning various aspects that we have to consider in the whole story of decriminalization and legalization, because the two of them are not necessarily the same. So we need to be conscious of the differences, what each one means, and how it affects people, how it affects the health, how we control young people from starting. Because as Professor Antoine gave, the brain is at a stage in young people where it can't handle certain things yet. So we have to be conscious of all these things. It's not really surprising to me anyway, and I'm sure to most of you, that we are pawns in a game. The industrialists up north, and they tried to destroy marijuana in Jamaica because they wanted to make money off it. You know, it's not a big secret if we want to close our eyes and pretend that never happened. I remember when President Reagan was president and Manley did not sign on to one of these agreements they had, I don't remember the name right now. They gave Air Jamaica so much trouble. They would inspect the plane down to its most minute part. If they found one seed of marijuana, there were fines beyond fines, you know, and that sort of thing. Just different forms of harassment, so it's not new. So it's left to us, you know, to admit these things have happened, that we should have our strategies for dealing with them, and to bring this whole process forward, okay? So this is, in short, what we are doing here today. There are other sessions to come after the lunch break. We're going to talk about the economic aspects of it, and then I think the legal. So at this point, I'm not quite sure that Reverend Prescott, will you take over from here, or is it Bishop?
Hello.
Yes,
I'm actually on the Zoom.
Yes, okay, you're going to contribute to the discussion?
Yeah.
Okay, so please start off by stating your name.
Aisha Williams.
President,
You
good
hear me?
afternoon.
Go ahead.
My question was Dr. Prabhakar. Did you, when you mentioned the do you think that the fact that the law is the way it is, that cannabis is illegal, contributes more to those people coming into your services? Being that using substances actually should be treated as a health issue and not a criminal issue? Would you agree or disagree that the criminalizing of a plant allows for such things to happen, where you would have patients or clients coming to you that will show these substances in their system, whether it's the substance that's causing a problem or not? Because the law is prohibited, one you mentioned even research, you can't really fully explore the plant to find out what it can do because the law is prohibited. So, and because it's prohibited, it's causing people to do things in secret where they should be seeking medical professional help, counseling, elders. Do you think that the law itself, as it is, being illegal, contributes more to the negative effects that it has on psychotherapy or people with underlying conditions?
It is definitely possible that the law could contribute to health issues. I'm not saying the drug, the herb, or whatever it is, if it is in blood at a particular level, yes, it is possible it will contribute to health. As far as I'm concerned, as a doctor, health issues are more important to me, and I will treat that part. The legality part of it, I will leave it to them. I don't want to involve myself.
Okay, so second question. And I have to throw a law in it just because of how it plays the thing. Would changing the law, do you think, in your opinion, do you think changing the law would allow or decrease people's usage so that you won't be able to see that result in the people that come into your office? For example, when we tell the child don't use the cookie, they take the cookie. If it's a legal regime where you know you can choose, as we were saying, where you're educated on what's there, you can choose. You can now choose legally, responsibly.
Right.
Changing that regime would increase the result, or make better the results you see in your offices. That there's less people coming in with that in their system who have whatever troubles they might have medically.
In the initial stages, we might see a bit more in the initial stages, but eventually it will plateau out or maybe even be less. It's just like alcohol is. Alcohol is available on the shelves of the supermarket. Not everybody would go and buy it, would we? You see, it's just like that. In the initial stages, there is probably a curiosity or something to go and do it. Maybe we'll see an increase, but not for long. But how long is this increase we see? That is what is important to us as a society. Is it 2 years, 1 year, 6 months? I cannot tell you or predict what it is, but this initial increase would definitely be. That's my assumption.
Thank you very much.
Hello, hi. Denise Ogilvie, I'm in Illinois. But my husband, everybody knows Chalky, Minister David, as Richard Ogilvie Ritchie Bogart. And with that, he was a Rastafarian. I'm also an NGO leader who has worked in the prison and done a lot of projects with the prison. And I now know the word phenomenological research, which has been me sitting with a lot of people just having discussion, including Saisha. And that has opened up my eyes to a whole new world. And one of the things that we're speaking of in the way of, I'm in a college right now, and one of the problems is abuse of all sorts of drugs, including the drug Adderall, which people use to actually study. And to come down, they actually use marijuana. Marijuana has a couple of strains, significant strains, the sativa and the, God Saisha, help me, and the indica, right? And one of the things is a lot of students use sativa for studying, believe it or not, and indica to just relax. I'm learning as everybody else is, and finding a lot of this. In fact, in learning, because in the state that I am, it's legalized. In fact, I found out that there was a seed bank beyond everything we know in Missouri, just across the state line. I'm on the Mississippi. So it's been very interesting. And although we are behind, there's a lot we can learn from what has gone before us and better it. Because one of the problems that we have, because the land, if you're talking about socio-ecological systems, the land is important and how we treat it and how we farm it. I see that with the Rastafarian brethren, everybody's planting. In fact, at one time we were sitting on the beach when we were finding out that people weren't getting seals again because a lot of elitists were actually growing their own, yeah, in our more prominent areas. So, and that impacted the livelihoods of some of the Rasta brethren that I know. So it's amazing how we are wondering how this will go. But envisage this. If everybody could go tree, the market might crash. I'll not deny that. Market might crash because everybody could consume their own. God rest my husband's soul. I know he very much wished to grow his own because we have a high incidence of chemical abuse or fertilizer import from St. Vincent. My concerns are also for the environment and keeping the environment, which we all live on, in a sustainable manner. And clear cutting those trees, if we mass produce like how California does, I don't think our environment will be able to do this. But it heartens me to hear about the Dominican lady and how she's growing it as companion planting, which is what I perceive I was hearing. Because if we do these plants with all our other plants and co-crop them with, in a way that is more polyculture versus monoculture, we can do all our high nutraceuticals, moringa, neem, marijuana, cannabis, ganja, whatever you want to call it, right? Ginger, turmeric, and one can feed off the other as a guild and be grown. And there could be many layers of economy for the Rasta man. And all of them, it is not just the ganja plant that they know has healing possibilities. They know that there are possibilities in wellness. In fact, before they could understand it through the clinical eyes like Omawali, they understood it naturally. And for the bishop, you would want to go to I'm now researching with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where they've done some archaeological research and found in crucibles and in altars resin of cannabis. which they were probably using in oils. I don't know if they were smoking it, but I know that they were using it in oils. Yeah? But to say that if this is in biblical times, the origins might be right in with the righteous already, but ignorance, knowledge is power, is how we can emancipate ourselves from this feeling of being burdened by the colonial society, oppressing our thinking, oppressing our culture, oppressing who we are. Because it is alive and well here as an industry. And just to say to you, it is in salves, it is in chocolate, which is one of the premier edibles that you're getting. Think about our industries. But we have to also be careful because Monsanto's and Marlboro have come together to patent seeds. And we know where that left us in our ordinary agriculture, what that meant to people. So origins of seed are really important. There are many things. Once you decriminalize this or you legalize this or whatever you do, there are many things. If you talk about social impact, you want to make sure that there are no major companies coming to Moraway Hills and do hundreds of seeds. Our geology and our environment cannot withstand that impact. But if they do small farmers who integrate crop with other things, they have a better choice of modus operandi for a sustainable future. It is the way that people like Whole Foods are going, working with smaller farmers. So I'm saying all of this to say there's lots to think about the socio-economic impacts. And I go as far as the environmental impacts. And if we do it, we have things that we can use. We can use fish emulsion and seaweed emulsion. It is possible to make it ourselves because it comes from our natural resources. It is possible to co-plant with it other things. It is possible to, but large amounts, we need CARICOM to spit back out CARDI into research. We need UE, and not close research people. Don't take ownership because then you're talking rubbish when you talk about social equity. It's got to be widely disseminated. It's not proprietary. Please. I know how universities are. I'm living in academia right now, and I know how it is. Do not stranglehold the society for knowledge. Help us to find this. The Rastas were on the verge. They just need to. Gone is a gentleman called Dennis Brown. He didn't live long enough. A sociologist out of Mona, if anybody knows him. But for the Rasta men that have been incarcerated, and yes, I know, the police used to come to my husband and say, Ras, I'll plant something on you. It is a fair factor that, if anything, we can't afford Prozac and Zantac. That has been the Rasta man's psychological assistants, their professors, you know, because at the end of the day, the threats that they live by, the social circumstances of poverty that they live by. I've seen people tell their children that they have to cut their locks from their head to go to school. Those are traumatizing things. And so you understand now why you might see some violence out of it. I know my husband had his moments. Talkie and they can testify out there. So I compete with David. But it was because of the trauma of life of being a Rasta man. I hope you take these things into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Any other? We have another Zoom. We have somebody here who wants to talk, eh?
Yeah, good day. My name is Rasmana Ikutin. Well, what I really have to say, much of it has already been said, yeah? But what I'm basically basing on right now is that the Rastas has been going through a lot of struggle for many of the years. And the struggle we are going through is not for praying or not for doing other work, planting food or doing other things. It's mainly for the marijuana, you know? And we have been brutal. We have gone through a lot of discrimination and many other things, and even, you know, beaten so badly and all them things there. So what I'm really trying to say right now that the government should try to institute some people, you know, or organization to really educate the people on marijuana and the uses of marijuana, because marijuana is not only to smoke. In the Caribbean and in Grenada, we use marijuana as a smoking because we can't get a chance to do any other thing with it. From the time you get it, you have to get rid of it. Yeah? You can't do nothing else with it. So we use it as a smoking, but marijuana is an industrial crop. You could make all different products with marijuana. So we should try to educate ourselves more about industrializing marijuana instead of just smoking. You know, we're looking at the smoking part, and this is a criminal offense to the people who use marijuana. So I just like to say that, you know, that we should look into the thing more seriously as a people, and not just blaming one set of people, or, you know, you're targeting one set of people, because there is so much poverty and different things rising up in the country and even around the world. So I mean, it's good that the government to try to really open the door so that the Rastas or the people, because it's not only Rastas that deal with marijuana in Grenada, you know. It's many other people, non-Rastas and things, who deal with marijuana, and they have good effect. They have, you know what I mean, good reasoning about the marijuana, and marijuana does no harm to people. That is something that we have to study seriously about, you know, because there are studies go on in many big parts of the world that marijuana is not no dangerous drug. It's not even a drug. Yeah?
It may not be a drug, but as the professor said, it does have certain psychotic. Oh, sorry. Yes, it's not a drug, but as the professor said, it does have certain psychotic properties. And according to the other circumstances in the individual's life at the time, these will come to the fore. So we must be careful not to make general statements that are not always completely true. You with me?
What I'm trying to say now, we have different types of substance in the marijuana, right? You could use it differently than the smoking. So if someone get a problem with the smoking, then they could use the oil.
Think about the tea.
They could use it in many different ways, you know? And some of these people too, certain information have been hidden and distorted so that we wouldn't even come to the fullness of the truth of the marijuana. You know, so this is something that we need to do some serious studies about.
Well, I think today was a good start.
I give thanks. I really appreciate, you know, give thanks for everyone that could have come out, and I really appreciate that we start something today, and the government could work alongside with the Rastas and the people of Grenada who really looking to see marijuana legal.
I don't like the term Rastas.
So, thank you very much for the coming out and
thank you. Yes. Thank you for your contribution.
Yeah.
Anybody else on Zoom?
Yeah.
Somebody's coming up?
Sorry, Brother Omawale. I've been trying to get them to get your attention also. So when I'm finished, some of this has direct, I'm going to direct towards you yourself. If you can elaborate on some of it. So just to start, the pastor earlier had mentioned his ignorance. A couple of people have mentioned the fear. Dr. Antoine had said that her personal opinion is legalize is the way to go. That's because cooking the food 15 times, adding a different ingredient each time doesn't really make sense. Cook it once and make it right. Denise, give thanks. Brother did a lot of work here to move this motion forward, and I'm kind of sad that he's not here to see this actually happening. The fear, though, is what I really want to address. A couple months ago, we had a discussion, I think it was hosted by PBN, I think, and there were some people from the diaspora, and they asked, one of the questions I asked was, what is the reason that we're not discussing, or what is the reason that would prevent us from full legalization? And one of the reasons that was given was the UN Drug Act. The issue I have now is that act has been addressed in December and changed. So we do not have that quote-unquote fear of breaking treaties or not having agreements with people. So in that light, Denise and Brother Omar, do you see the fear in our diaspora, not only in Grenada, I would say especially in Grenada, but throughout the diaspora, as crippling? What would be your suggestion to break that fear cycle? Because trust me, I've done many things to break that cycle. And for some odd reason, I can't seem to crack it. Like I've even asked the brothers and sisters who came here to discuss the way forward. Have you done it in your country? Have you broken that cycle of fear that we have, where we are afraid to speak to power? We won't support the thing that literally would keep us from going to jail. The doctor just mentioned that he sees patients. And we know that because the law is illegal against cannabis, prohibitive against cannabis, it is causing people to do their thing. Yet we won't take the steps necessary to change the law, to have these open, adult-like conversations, to figure out what's the best way forward. Do you think this fear that's been crippling us, one, can be changed? If so, what is your recommendations of how to get us to not being so afraid anymore?
You were speaking to Dr. Amo. He's gone. Who was he speaking to? I think he was speaking to Dr. Amawale, you know. But anybody here, I'm not sure. Do we have Dr. Amawale still on Zoom? The question was directed to him.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, the question was directed to Dr. Amawale, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm going
he's
to
here.
exploit the opportunity the question provides me to say a couple of things that I neglected to say earlier. I may hover around your question, my brother, but I did want to sort of reinforce what Dr. Narasimhan, Dr. Prabhakar Narasimhan mentioned, and that is that there are clinical records and experiences with individuals who, even at their first initiation to marijuana use, developed panic attacks, had significant anxiety. We know of cases of melancholia and sadness, even of psychosis and frank addiction. But the point I would make about that is that what that argues for is a therapeutic or treatment response. What is quite clear is that police and courts have absolutely nothing to do with this. What we need to have is widely available, competent, professional care that individuals can access without barriers. The other thing I should say is that all substances, I'll avoid using the term drug or herb, let's just say be a little more generic. All substances are not equal. There are substances that addict anyone who uses it regularly, like tobacco, like cocaine. Even though the times from initiation to addiction vary, sometimes widely. Unless you stop, you're eventually going to hit that wall. But there are other substances that you can use all of your life and not become addicted, like alcohol. Everybody does not become an alcoholic, and as long as we've been working with alcoholism, we cannot explain the complexity of alcoholic addiction risk. We don't know why this one and not that one. But we do recognize that alcoholism is a clinical syndrome and requires treatment. So there are some people who will become addicted to marijuana. There are many people who will not. as many people have already asserted. They can use it for decades, a whole lifetime, and exercise some discretion, some control. But it doesn't really matter, because what matters more is that there is not a criminal justice penalty with all of its social and economic consequences that is triggered by an addiction to this substance, but rather there is a clinical response. People can, without stigma, seek and get access to quality care, so that if you have an anxiety response, or if you should develop an addiction, there is a way in which that you can address it with professionals. And a final comment about drug or drunk driving or adolescent prohibition. You know, the report covers that really very well. This report gives us everything we could possibly need in our churches, in our community centers, in our sports organizations, in ministries, in parliament. Gives us all that we could possibly need to seed rich discussions, and we ought to be busy doing that. But a quick comment about drunk driving and adolescent prohibition. You know, we have laws against adolescent access to purchasing and using alcohol. You all know that. But you also know that it's a very public and common incident in which these laws are violated, even in the presence of policemen. You know, there are laws in Grenada, certainly, and the rest of the Caribbean against drunk driving. But a policeman will stop you about your broken light. You got to carry about Guinness in your hand. And he doesn't say anything to you about that. So, if we should decriminalize these substances and worry about adolescent prohibition and drunk driving, we want to emphasize the professional enforcement of regulations. But those are not reasons not to go forward. You know, alcohol by itself and tobacco by itself, each of them, causes more death than all the illegal substances combined. I want to leave you with that. So what we're doing today, at least what I want to do, is to strengthen the argument against criminal justice, interference, and responses. You want to take that money that we give to the drug squad and to investigators and to the courts, even drug courts, and create treatment responses with this, including health promotion, prevention, early case screening and identification, and ultimately treatment for people who have developed some hearing problems. I won't come back after this. Thank you for Oh, my brother, did I even get close to the issue of failure? Because, you know, you're talking about politicians. And I like Dr. Prabhakar, especially living in small countries where everybody knows everybody else. I am hesitant to really speculate about why politicians do what they do, and what their schedule of intervention is. I like what Minister David said today. I appreciate the continuum approach. But he said that at least criminalization is supposed to be where everybody is okay. And other steps might be taken by particular countries. It would be nice if CARICOM and our region should march as one on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mawali. Okay.
You actually did touch on it a bit, in a holistic manner, I would put it.
I don't know who's talking. Who is talking? We have now some takeaway points. This is rather personal. Lunch has come and we have some sessions this afternoon, so we don't want to spend the entire day on this session. So I now invite Dr. Stephen Fletcher to the podium, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, comrades, friends, everyone. In the interest of time, I will try to be pretty brief with the takeaways. But before I get into takeaways, if you don't mind, Madam Chair, I would just like to use the opportunity to give a quick response to the last person who raised a question about fear. I think it's an important aspect to be addressed because it is contextualized in the sense, well, there are changes at the UN level. Domestically, we are making some changes. What's the fear in doing the entire hog, yeah? Or going to full legalization and so forth. There are two dimensions to it. One, there is a political issue that has been raised by Dr. Umawali, but there is also the real financial and economic issue. We have in the midst of us, I think, Mr. Lester Andel, who will understand this issue very well. Although we can pass local laws here that provide a framework, whether it's decriminalization or legalization, the banking system comes up against the Financial Action Task Force and the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, who are basically the bankers' police or the financial policemen. At one time, compliance officers was not the norm in banks. It was their REFing, protecting against risk. Today, compliance officers are the norm because the banking system in Grenada, for example, has to comply with international rules and regulations that focuses on money laundering and anti-terrorism rules. And therefore, if the banking system here was not to follow these rules and regulations, the brother on the Zoom is listening, we can run serious financial troubles that lead to things like de-risking of, not de-risking, but the loss of corresponding banking relationships with external banks, thus making it extremely difficult for the banks here to operate, because you'll basically be cut off from the international, I think we have lost volume here, you'll be cut off from the international financial system because you will be deemed to be facilitating money laundering and so on and so forth. So there is this real issue that has to be addressed, and I'm going to be dealing with it this afternoon in some more detail when it comes to my topic. So I just wanted to raise that here. Overall, I think this morning was extremely useful. It set the right tone for the day's discussion, starting with Dr. Antoine, who basically laid out a very important first point, which should underline our discussions. When she indicated that the establishment of the commission by CARICOM was really to ensure that there is a non-partisan and non-political aspect to this issue. It is very important that we bear this in mind. It is not just a political issue. It is not a partisan issue. It is a people's issue. And we must focus on it in that sense, okay? The other issue that was raised is that of the importance of social justice in these discussions, which is in response to all the injustices and inequalities that had taken place over the years. That was taken up later on by almost every member of the panel that followed. And therefore it became an underlying theme, the issue of social justice and legal reform was an integral part of this process. The other issue that we need to take away with us is that despite the fact that we are talking about decriminalization, legislation, legalization and so forth, there is a real caution. I think every speaker raised the issue of caution in the way that this is done, especially on the impact of children and the young minds. I think those are critical issues, and they are cross-cutting issues by every speaker. We should bear in mind. Just to highlight two other things quickly, Dr. Crawford, I think, made a very important point and started off with the whole historical context of this issue. And she certainly phrased it in the historical and sociological context so that we can understand the evolution of this issue and place it
in my humble opinion, I don't know how she interpreted the sociological issues in that sense, but I will say in a real society way, in a societal way that we can relate to the issues as they unfold, and more will be said on that. We then followed by Dr. Umawali and Dr. Dr. Probaka, which Dr. Probaka, I should say, he gave way to Dr. Umawali in concurring fundamentally with all of the views, as he said, 99% of the views that were expressed by Dr. Umawali. And I will end on Dr. Umawali's note, where he said that there are 3 issues that needs to be addressed concurrently on this: participation, empowering of communities, and allowing for equitable access to the resources that will come from this industry, as well as the resources that are needed to protect against the downsides of this industry. So I will end here. Thank you very much, and have yourself a good lunch while I hand over to the facilitator of this session.
Well, let's just first of all thank Dr. Crawford Daniel. He has a class and has to leave, so we thank her very much. I'm sorry, I'm not on. We want to just thank Dr. Crawford Daniel, who has to leave. She has a class to teach. That's how she goes and inspires them, as she has inspired us this morning. So thank you very much, Wendy, for being here with us today. And so let's give her a round of applause to send her out. I think lunch is ready. I think who's going to say something about that? The Bishop or Sandra? Bishop.
Lunch is served behind the screens there. There are some special lunches for our Rastafarian brothers and sisters, right? So they are easily identifiable. We're going to go, we hope that we can get back here by 1:15, right? That should give us enough time to be